Around the closing years of the 1030s, the Benedictine monk Rodulfus Glaber, who died around 1047, completed the third volume of his 5 books of histories. Although he never claimed to be a great scholar, he possessed a remarkable ability to observe the world around him. Looking back at the 1,000 years that had passed since the birth of Christ, he described an age filled with extraordinary events. The deaths of powerful rulers, the appearance of a blazing comet, and the devastating fire that consumed the monastery of Mont Saint-Michel all seemed to signal that the world was entering a new era. Yet what impressed him most was something entirely different. Around the 3rd year of the new millennium, he believed that Europe itself had been transformed, as churches began rising across the landscape in astonishing numbers. He famously wrote that the world had wrapped itself in a shining white cloak of churches, as though it had finally cast aside the weight of the past and stepped into a brighter future. Few medieval writers have left behind a sentence that continues to capture the imagination of historians as strongly as this one. Today, many scholars agree that Glaber was describing a genuine wave of construction that spread throughout much of Western Europe during the first half of the 11th century. Across countless towns, villages, monasteries, and cathedral cities, builders introduced fresh architectural ideas while refining older traditions. Some researchers have suggested that Glaber's reference to a white mantle may have reflected the pale limestone or marble used in prestigious churches, particularly in regions famous for fine stonework. Others argue that the phrase was never intended as a literal description at all. Instead, they believe it symbolized a society renewing itself after centuries of uncertainty. Whatever the exact meaning, Glaber clearly sensed that Europe was undergoing profound political, economic, and cultural change. Interestingly, Glaber did not admire these churches because they displayed revolutionary engineering or artistic innovation. In his opinion, many older churches had already been built with skill and dignity. What truly fascinated him was the enthusiasm behind the rebuilding effort. Christian communities eagerly competed with one another, each hoping to construct a church more magnificent than those nearby. This rivalry reflected confidence rather than vanity. To Glaber, these ambitious projects demonstrated the renewed strength of Christian belief. Throughout his writings, he repeatedly praised the rapid expansion of Latin Christianity and the growing influence of monasteries connected with the Cluniac Reform movement. The churches themselves became visible proof that faith was flourishing once again. Some modern historians have taken Glaber's famous image even further. Rather than interpreting the white cloak as a description of architecture, they see it as a spiritual symbol representing purification, renewal, and baptism. Whether Glaber consciously intended such deeper meanings can never be known with certainty. Yet his choice of architectural imagery speaks volumes. For an 11th century monk, churches were never simply buildings of stone and timber. They represented the presence of God within society and stood as physical expressions of Christian identity. The story of medieval Christian architecture begins during Glaber's lifetime and continues into the early years of the Protestant Reformation. Over those centuries, artistic innovation appeared in different parts of Western Europe, constantly shifting from one region to another. Earlier generations of historians devoted enormous effort to identifying where new architectural ideas first emerged and tracing how they spread across the continent. Medieval writers themselves rarely viewed architecture in such a systematic way. Modern scholarship has also sometimes created the mistaken impression that every new building style completely replaced the one before it. In reality, medieval builders often blended old techniques with new ideas, allowing multiple traditions to exist side by side for generations. Even so, the work of 19th and 20th century historians established the chronological framework still used to study medieval architecture today. Their classifications remain valuable, although modern research increasingly recognizes that architectural development was far more gradual and complex than once believed. Rather than following a straight path from one style to another, medieval architecture evolved through continuous experimentation, adaptation, and regional diversity. The main focus throughout this period falls upon churches, monasteries, and other religious buildings. Castles and defensive structures certainly played an important role in medieval society, but they belong to a different architectural story. At the same time, it would be misleading to imagine a strict division between sacred and secular life. Many medieval buildings served both religious and practical purposes, combining places of worship with administrative, educational, or residential functions. Understanding these buildings also requires asking important questions about the people who paid for them, the craftsmen who designed them, and the motivations that inspired such enormous investments of wealth and labor. Above all, medieval Christians believed that a church building represented much more than its physical form. Stone walls, towering columns, and decorated interiors symbolized the spiritual community gathered within them. Constructing a church meant giving visible form to an invisible faith. Every new cathedral, abbey, or parish church reflected the identity, hopes, and devotion of the people who built it. In many ways, creating a church was also an act of creating a community. Glaber's own writings leave little doubt that he viewed construction as an expression of divine purpose. Shortly after describing the great wave of church building, he praised the rebuilding of the monastery dedicated to Saint Martin at Tours. According to him, the project was directed by Hervé, the monastery's treasurer, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. He also referred to several other important churches that had either been rebuilt or greatly expanded during his lifetime, some of which he almost certainly visited himself. Most of Glaber's life unfolded within the lands controlled by the powerful dukes of Burgundy. Around the year 1016, he entered the monastery of Saint-Bénigne near Dijon, where an ambitious rebuilding project had recently reached completion under the leadership of William of Volpiano, an influential reforming abbot associated with Cluny. One of the church's most remarkable features was its enormous eastern rotunda, a circular structure inspired by ancient Christian and Roman architectural traditions. Such centrally planned spaces carried deep symbolic meanings, recalling both the Pantheon in Rome and the great shrines built over the tombs of early Christian martyrs. From Saint-Bénigne, Glaber later moved to the famous monastery of Cluny, already one of the most influential religious centers in Europe. During the following decades, Cluny embarked on an extraordinary rebuilding campaign. Between the late 11th and early 12th centuries, its new abbey church became one of the largest Christian buildings ever constructed. It even surpassed the size of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. A series of radiating chapels extended from the eastern end of the church, providing additional altars for the ever-growing community of priest-monks. The enormous scale of the complex reflected both the monastery's wealth and its spiritual authority across Latin Christendom. Toward the end of his life, sometime after 1039, Glaber settled at Saint-Germain in Auxerre. Around this period, the monastery added a spacious new entrance hall to its older Carolingian church, once again demonstrating the continuing enthusiasm for ambitious religious construction. Similar projects could be found throughout Western Europe during the 11th and 12th centuries. Wherever one traveled, churches were expanding, monasteries were rebuilding, and new architectural ideas were constantly emerging. Yet this remarkable building movement did not appear from nowhere. The roots stretched back to late antiquity, when Christianity first transformed the urban landscape of the Roman world. By around the year 700, cathedrals and monasteries already dotted much of the northern territories once ruled by Rome. During the reign of Charlemagne, hundreds of religious foundations were established or rebuilt, laying the foundations for the architectural revival that Glaber later witnessed. The collapse of the Carolingian Empire during the late 9th century also reshaped the religious geography of Europe. Viking raids forced many monasteries to flee with the relics of their patron saints, carrying these sacred treasures across great distances in search of safety. One famous example occurred in 836, when the monks of Noirmoutier escaped Viking attacks with the relics of Saint Philibert. After a long journey, they finally settled at Tournus in southern Burgundy. The relics never returned to their original home, and after a destructive fire in 1006, the community began constructing an impressive new church, dedicated not only to Saint Philibert, but also to the local martyr, Saint Valérien. Like so many churches of the age, it stood as a reminder that even destruction could become the beginning of renewal, transforming tragedy into one of medieval Europe's greatest periods of architectural achievement. The Great Abbey of Tournus dominated the surrounding countryside with its tall towers, just as it does today. Rising above the banks of the Saône River, one of the busiest trade and travel routes since Roman times, the monastery was impossible to ignore. For travelers approaching by land or water, the church announced its presence long before they reached its gates. That visibility was no accident. During the 11th century, churches were not only places of worship, but also unmistakable symbols of authority. Their massive stone walls and towering roofs reminded everyone that Christianity shaped every aspect of daily life. As more cathedrals, monasteries, and parish churches appeared across Europe, they created a network that organized society itself. From the smallest village parish to the entire Christian world, each community centered its religious life around the altar, making the church both the spiritual and social heart of medieval Europe. Beginning in the middle of the 10th century, Christian rulers steadily expanded their influence beyond existing frontiers. Wherever new lands were brought under Christian control, churches soon followed. They served as lasting markers of conquest, faith, and political power. Along the eastern frontier, King Otto I pushed his armies beyond the river Elbe, defeating the pagan Polabian Slavs during the 940s and extending his authority toward the Oder River. Military victories alone were not enough to secure these territories. Otto reinforced his achievements by founding new bishoprics and elevating Magdeburg into a powerful archbishopric. He had already established a monastery there in 937, and work on a magnificent cathedral began less than 2 decades later. Although Otto's original cathedral has disappeared, archaeological discoveries reveal that it once stood on an enormous scale. Interestingly, while traces of the cathedral survive beneath the modern city, historians have found little evidence of the royal palace that must also have existed nearby. This suggests where Otto chose to invest his greatest resources. Rather than building lavish royal residences, he devoted extraordinary wealth to religious monuments, even importing valuable marble and architectural pieces from Italy to decorate the church. Through these grand ecclesiastical projects, Otto presented himself not simply as a successful king, but as a defender and promoter of Christianity itself. A clearer impression of Ottonian architecture survives at Gernrode, a religious foundation established in 959 by Margrave Gero for a community of noble women. Although later centuries altered parts of the complex, much of its original design can still be recognized. The nave featured an unusual rhythm of alternating massive square piers and slender columns, creating a striking visual balance. Above the side aisles, galleries overlooked the main interior, while an impressive western entrance block, known as a westwork, added another layer of grandeur. These features reveal architects experimenting with forms that would influence church design for generations. Far to the southwest, the political situation was changing just as dramatically. As Islamic authority weakened across parts of the Iberian Peninsula during the early 11th century, Christian kingdoms gradually reclaimed territory. One of the defining moments came in 1085 when Alfonso VI captured Toledo after centuries of Muslim rule. Long before this triumph, however, his parents, King Ferdinand I and Queen Sancha, had already celebrated the strength of their kingdom through architecture. Around the middle of the century, they commissioned the Royal Chapel of San Pelayo in Leon, constructing it from carefully cut stone blocks that demonstrated both wealth and technical skill. A monumental entrance connected the chapel directly to the neighboring royal palace, emphasizing the close relationship between monarchy and the church. The prestige of Leon increased even further in 1063 when the relics of Saint Isidore were transferred there from Seville. Housing the remains of one of Spain's greatest saints transformed the church into an important destination for pilgrims. During the following century, Princess Urraca rebuilt much of the complex, ensuring that the royal church reflected the growing importance of the kingdom. At roughly the same time, another extraordinary building project began farther west. Starting in 1078, workers raised a vast new cathedral above the traditional burial place of St. James at Compostela. Over time, it became one of the greatest pilgrimage centers in medieval Europe, drawing travelers from every corner of Christendom. By the late 11th century, church construction had become woven into nearly every aspect of European society. Churches were no longer simply places for prayer. They proclaimed the strength of kingdoms, preserved the memory of rulers, protected the relics of saints, and projected Christian authority across the landscape. Even the silent presence of royal tombs and sacred relics reinforced the idea that political power and religious faith were inseparable. Historians often describe Romanesque architecture as the first truly European style because it spread across an enormous geographical area without depending on a single artistic center. Instead of one dominant region setting the standard, innovation emerged simultaneously in many different places. Monasteries exchanged ideas through their religious networks. Merchants carried techniques along commercial routes. Pilgrims introduced new designs as they journeyed from shrine to shrine. Royal marriages and political alliances also encouraged the movement of craftsmen across borders. Rather than isolated traditions, medieval architecture developed through constant communication between distant communities. Earlier generations of scholars attempted to divide Romanesque buildings into neat regional schools or classify them according to modern national boundaries. Yet medieval Europe rarely followed such convenient patterns. Churches standing only a few miles apart could display remarkably different styles, while builders separated by hundreds of kilometers sometimes produced surprisingly similar designs. Political borders, familiar today, simply did not exist in the same way during the Middle Ages, making modern national categories unreliable for understanding medieval architecture. The architectural revolution of the 11th century was driven as much by advances in construction as by changing artistic taste. Builders increasingly abandoned rough rubble masonry in favor of carefully shaped stone blocks known as ashlar. At first, these precisely cut stones were reserved for important structural elements such as corners, windows, and arches. Before long, however, entire churches, towers, and castles were constructed from dressed stone. This approach produced buildings that appeared stronger, more orderly, and visually refined than earlier structures. Among the earliest examples were the Great Keep at Loches, built for the formidable Count Fulk Nera of Anjou, and the impressive western tower of the Abbey at Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire. Contemporary writers noticed these developments. Andrew, a monk who wrote the life of Abbot Goslin around 1042, praised the careful use of dressed stone and declared that the building was intended to serve as a model worthy of admiration throughout Gaul. His comments echoed Rodolphus Glaber's belief that monasteries sought to surpass one another through increasingly magnificent construction. The use of finely cut stone was impressive enough that inscriptions proudly mentioned it. In Leon, the dedicatory inscription celebrating the royal chapel, built by Ferdinand and Sancha, specifically highlighted the quality of its stonework. Medieval observers naturally compared these carefully crafted buildings with the biblical description of Solomon's temple, whose enormous stone blocks symbolized divine perfection. Patrons responsible for such ambitious churches could therefore be celebrated as New Solomons, rulers whose wisdom and devotion found expression in magnificent architecture. Despite these remarkable achievements, medieval chroniclers rarely explained exactly why architectural innovations appeared or where new ideas first originated. Builders themselves left few written records, forcing historians to reconstruct their methods through surviving structures. During the middle decades of the 11th century, architects became increasingly interested in organizing the surfaces of buildings. Rather than leaving walls as broad, uninterrupted plains, they introduced attached columns, pilasters, and decorative arcades that divided elevations into clearly defined sections. These features created a greater sense of rhythm, balance, and visual order. Among the best-known decorative elements were the so-called Lombard bands, shallow pilaster strips connected by small arches along exterior walls. Although traditionally associated with northern Italy, similar designs appeared across a vast region stretching from Catalonia to the Adriatic coast and deep into Central Europe. At the same time, many builders preferred rounded, engaged columns that projected from walls both inside and outside their churches. In places such as Auxerre, arches received bold, rounded moldings that dramatically emphasized their structure. Across Europe, masons experimented with an astonishing variety of forms, transforming once flat walls into richly sculpted architectural compositions. England also embraced these new ideas. Construction of Ely Cathedral after 1081 introduced alternating cylindrical columns and massive compound piers built from clusters of shafts. This combination produced a powerful visual rhythm that guided visitors naturally through the enormous interior. Everywhere, architects explored new ways of shaping stone, giving medieval churches a richness and complexity that differed greatly from the simpler interiors inherited from the early Christian centuries. Toward the end of the 11th century, another major transformation gathered momentum. Increasingly, patrons wanted their churches crowned with heavy stone vaults instead of wooden roofs. Inspiration came partly from surviving Roman buildings, especially those still standing in northern Italy and Spain. Yet, medieval builders adapted these ancient examples to suit their own techniques. Roman vaults often relied on lightweight construction, whereas Romanesque vaults were generally made from thick rubble and mortar. Supporting such enormous weight required stronger walls, larger piers, and powerful external buttressing. One of the greatest examples of this development appeared at Speyer Cathedral within the Holy Roman Empire. Originally begun under Emperor Conrad II, the cathedral underwent dramatic changes during the reign of his grandson, Henry IV. Around the turn of the 12th century, the wooden ceiling above the central nave was replaced with an enormous groin vault spanning roughly 14 meters. At the same time, the cathedral's transepts received ribbed vaults, perhaps to emphasize the imperial burial spaces that Henry intended for his dynasty. Initially, these ribbed vaults probably attracted attention less because of their engineering advantages than because of their striking appearance. The intersecting ribs created elegant geometric patterns that filled the vast interior with a new sense of order and grandeur. As the 12th century progressed, however, builders gradually realized that ribs offered practical benefits as well. Once the stone framework had been completed, lighter masonry could fill the spaces between, simplifying construction while allowing greater flexibility in design. For historians today, medieval churches reveal two equally fascinating stories. On one hand, they express the ambitions, beliefs, and political goals of the rulers, bishops, abbots, and communities that financed them. On the other, they showcase the remarkable knowledge of medieval architects and master masons whose technical skill transformed raw stone into some of Europe's most enduring monuments. Every Romanesque church stands as both an act of faith and a masterpiece of engineering, preserving in its walls the imagination of those who dreamed it and the craftsmanship of those who brought it to life. The emergence of Gothic architecture was not the result of a single carefully planned revolution. According to the architectural historian Jean Bonny, it developed almost unexpectedly when builders in the middle of the 12th century began to understand the full potential of pointed arches and ribbed vaults. At first, Paris and the surrounding territories controlled by the French monarchy were not among the most energetic architectural regions of Europe. Other areas possessed stronger building traditions and more active workshops. Yet the situation gradually changed as French kings spent more time in Paris, the city's economy expanded, and its schools developed into one of Europe's most influential universities. With political, intellectual, and commercial life becoming concentrated there, large-scale construction began to flourish once again. Builders in the Paris region remained attached to an older architectural preference for relatively thin walls and light surfaces. They showed little enthusiasm for the massive, heavily decorated churches being constructed elsewhere. At the same time, however, patrons increasingly demanded stone rib vaults rather than traditional wooden roofs. These two desires appeared difficult to combine. Heavy vaults normally required thick walls and enormous supporting piers, yet Parisian designers wanted interiors that felt open and refined. Their attempt to solve this contradiction produced a new architectural system. Pointed arches, carefully positioned supports, and ribbed vaults allowed the weight of the ceiling to be controlled more efficiently. Walls could become thinner, columns more slender, and windows much larger. From this practical challenge emerged the first recognizable language of Gothic architecture. The building most frequently connected with this transformation is the Benedictine Abbey of Saint-Denis, located just beyond the northern edge of Paris. The monastery held exceptional historical importance because many Merovingian and Carolingian rulers had been buried there. During the early 1140s, its ambitious abbot Suger undertook a major rebuilding campaign. After completing a new western entrance, he turned his attention to the eastern end of the church, where the precious relics of Saint Denis were displayed and honored. The surviving ambulatory and the ring of chapels around the sanctuary reveal how daring the project was. Instead of being separated by thick stone walls, the chapels flow naturally into one another. Delicate shafts and narrow columns rise toward lightly decorated ribbed vaults, creating a sense of continuous movement through the interior. Pointed arches distribute the weight more effectively, while carefully placed external supports make it possible to open enormous windows in the outer walls. Sunlight pours through colored glass and fills the sanctuary with a glowing, almost supernatural atmosphere. For Boney and many later scholars, Saint-Denis represents the birthplace of Gothic architecture. Yet the style did not appear there in a perfectly complete form. What modern viewers recognize as Gothic, the soaring height, skeletal stone framework, vast windows, and apparent weightlessness, developed gradually through many experiments conducted at different building sites. Saint-Denis was therefore less a sudden beginning than a decisive moment in a much longer process. Between roughly 1150 and 1250, architectural development in northeastern France accelerated dramatically. New solutions appeared so quickly that builders seemed to be studying, challenging, and improving upon one another's work from project to project. Theologian Peter the Chanter jokingly described the enthusiasm as a kind of building disease. Bishops, abbots, rulers, and urban communities competed to create churches that were taller, brighter, more technically daring, and more impressive than anything constructed before. Still, the new architecture of northern France did not immediately fascinate everyone. In Sicily, King William II began the Cathedral of Montreal in 1174 without attempting to imitate French churches. Instead, he embraced the island's unique combination of Byzantine, Islamic, and Latin traditions. The cathedral's interior was formed by classical columns supporting broad arches, while great areas of wall remained open for glittering mosaics. Above them stood an exposed timber roof rather than a complex system of stone vaulting. Montreal demonstrated that medieval Europe possessed many architectural languages and that Gothic was only one of several prestigious possibilities. Even in regions closer to Paris, builders adapted Gothic ideas according to local taste. In Normandy, Anjou, and England, architects often preferred richly patterned surfaces, elaborate moldings, and increasingly complicated vault designs. Rather than simply copying French buildings, they transformed imported techniques into distinctive regional traditions. Gothic architecture spread not as a fixed formula, but as a flexible system that could be reshaped in countless ways. Around the year 1200, even the major cathedrals of northeastern France offered sharply different visions. Bourges, Chartres, and Auxerre were all Gothic, yet their interiors created completely different experiences. Bourges Cathedral, begun shortly before 1195, was designed around a vast and unified interior. Double aisles ran along both sides of the main nave, and each part of the building rose to a different height. From the central vessel, visitors could look through the tall arcades into the surrounding aisles, where smaller versions of the main elevation repeated its visual structure. The result was a layered space that seemed to unfold continuously from the center toward the outer walls. Chartres Cathedral, rebuilt after a devastating fire in 1194, followed another path. Here, the strongest emphasis was placed on height. Massive piers and soaring arches drew the eye upward, while enlarged clerestory windows filled the upper walls with colored light. This was made possible by the systematic use of flying buttresses, which transferred the outward pressure of the vaults beyond the walls and down into external supports. The walls no longer needed to carry the full weight of the roof, allowing them to be opened for increasingly large windows. At Auxerre, where work on the eastern end began after 1215, architects pursued elegance and visual illusion. They divided the wall into separate thin layers, creating a sense of depth and delicacy. Passages, arches, and slender supports appeared to overlap one another, making the solid masonry seem almost weightless. These three cathedrals show that Gothic architecture had not yet settled into a single dominant form. No one living around 1200 could have known that the structural system used at Chartres would become especially influential. Its combination of a three-level elevation, tall nave, large clear story, and flying buttresses later shaped the great cathedrals of Amiens, Reims, and Beauvais. These buildings pushed verticality and openness to extraordinary limits, yet they represented only one part of medieval architectural production. Most churches were neither as large nor as richly decorated as the famous cathedrals that dominate modern histories of Gothic art. Many religious communities deliberately rejected excessive decoration. Cistercian monasteries and other reforming orders often preferred restrained buildings that reflected ideals of humility, discipline, and spiritual concentration. Financial limitations also influenced design, especially in smaller towns and religious houses. Yet, simplicity should not always be understood merely as poverty or religious austerity. From the middle of the 13th century onward, buildings such as Saint-Martin-aux-Bois demonstrated that carefully controlled proportions and reduced decoration could possess their own powerful beauty. Elegance could be achieved through clarity rather than abundance. By the middle of the 13th century, Paris and northeastern France had gained a reputation as Europe's leading architectural center. Technical innovation played an important role in this rise, but politics and royal image were equally significant. Louis IX of France was presented as the ideal Christian monarch, an image carefully cultivated from his youth by his mother, Blanche of Castile. His reputation for devotion, justice, and sacred kingship enhanced the prestige of the artistic projects connected with the royal court. The most celebrated monument of this royal culture was the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. Its upper chapel appears less like a conventional stone building than an immense chamber made from colored glass. Tall, stained glass windows occupy nearly the entire height of the walls, held within a narrow and elegant framework of arches and shafts. Sculptures of the apostles, painted decoration, and precious enamel-like surfaces gave the interior the appearance of monumental metalwork. Scholars have often described it as a glass cage because the masonry seems to disappear behind the glowing windows. The chapel was not designed simply as a place for royal worship. It functioned as an enormous reliquary created to house the crown of thorns and other objects believed to be connected with the Passion of Christ. Louis IX acquired the crown of thorns in 1239, and construction of the chapel began soon afterward. By placing these relics within the royal palace, Louis strengthened the sacred character of French kingship and presented Paris as a new spiritual center of Christendom. The building caused a sensation among Europe's ruling elite. A humorous French poem from around 1260 claimed that Henry III of England admired the chapel so much that he wished he could carry it home on a cart. Almost a century later, Emperor Charles IV created a larger chapel inspired by it at Aachen. Sainte-Chapelle became not only a masterpiece of architecture, but also a model of how rulers could use sacred buildings to express political legitimacy and personal devotion. Royal patrons, however, were not the only forces shaping architecture during this period. Monasteries, bishops, cathedral chapters, noble families, and urban communities continued to commission major works. After 1231, the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis underwent another extensive reconstruction. Most of Suger's building disappeared, although the western section, crypt, and eastern ambulatory were retained. The new interior adopted the three-level arrangement made famous at Chartres, but its surfaces were united through increasingly elaborate stone tracery inspired by developments at Reims and Amiens. Within each great clear story window, narrow stone bars divided the opening into paired lights crowned by a rose. These divisions were then repeated on a smaller scale inside each section. Below, the same visual system continued through the triforium, where arches were filled with even more delicate patterns. Large architectural forms were broken down into smaller versions of themselves, creating a design that seemed to reproduce endlessly. The enormous building began to resemble a work of miniature craftsmanship enlarged to monumental scale. The transept facades were opened by giant rose windows whose patterns appeared to spread outward from the center like rays of light. This radiating quality gave the style its modern name, Rayonnant Gothic. In Rayonnant buildings, walls became increasingly transparent, and stonework functioned mainly as a fine framework holding expanses of glass. The visual effect was one of precision, elegance, and luminous complexity. Older studies of Gothic architecture often ended their main story near the close of the 13th century. They treated the great cathedrals of the early 1200s as the heroic summit of medieval building and assumed that architectural creativity declined after 1300. Later works were sometimes dismissed as rigid, repetitive, or evidence of a fading medieval world. Such judgments greatly underestimate what followed. In reality, Gothic architecture was still developing. By 1300, it had existed in recognizable form for less than 2 centuries and would remain active for more than 200 years. Architects continued to experiment with space, vaulting, decoration, and structural design throughout the later Middle Ages. The period around 1300 nevertheless marked an important transition. Gothic architecture became less concentrated in a limited number of leading centers and began to divide into increasingly diverse regional and stylistic traditions. The elegant 3-level elevation of the Rayonnant style remained an influential model for prestigious churches. Yet builders outside northeastern France rarely copied it without alteration. They adapted its principles to different local materials, traditions, political ambitions, and religious needs. Cologne Cathedral, whose choir was begun in 1248 and consecrated in 1322, followed the French model more closely than most. Elsewhere, however, architects reshaped the system so thoroughly that it produced entirely new forms. The choir of St. Vitus Cathedral in Prague provides a striking example. It was the only major section of the cathedral completed during the Middle Ages, yet it demonstrates how far Gothic architecture had traveled from its French origins. The building drew upon the prestigious Rayonnant tradition, but its designers reworked that inheritance in response to the imperial ambitions of Prague and the creative possibilities of a new architectural environment. By the 14th century, Gothic was no longer a style controlled by one region. It had become a shared European language, spoken with countless local accents. During the middle of the 12th century, Gothic architecture emerged not through a carefully planned revolution, but through a series of practical experiments. Builders gradually discovered that pointed arches and ribbed vaults could solve structural problems while creating lighter and taller interiors. Although Paris had not previously been Europe's leading architectural center, its growing political importance, expanding economy, and rising university transformed the city into a place of remarkable construction. Architects wanted to preserve elegant, slender walls while replacing wooden ceilings with stone vaults. By combining pointed arches, rib vaults, and carefully designed buttresses, they achieved buildings that appeared almost weightless, filled with space and light. The Abbey of Saint-Denis became the symbol of this transformation. Under the leadership of Abbot Suger during the 1140s, the eastern end of the church was rebuilt to honor Saint-Denis and display his relics. Instead of thick walls separating each chapel, graceful columns supported delicate vaults, while enormous stained glass windows flooded the sanctuary with colorful light. Although Gothic architecture continued evolving for many decades, Saint-Denis demonstrated a completely new vision in which engineering and beauty worked together to create an atmosphere unlike anything seen before. Over the next century, northern France experienced an extraordinary period of architectural innovation. Cathedrals seemed to compete with one another as builders constantly searched for better structural solutions and more impressive visual effects. Yet Gothic never became the only accepted style. In Sicily, for example, King William II chose Byzantine mosaics, Islamic influences, and classical forms for Monreale Cathedral rather than following French models. Across England, Normandy, and Anjou, architects adapted Gothic ideas to local traditions, proving that medieval Europe remained rich in regional diversity. Even within France, Gothic architecture developed along several different paths. Bourges Cathedral emphasized flowing interior space with its double aisles and layered elevations. Chartres focused on soaring height and enormous stained glass windows supported by flying buttresses, while Auxerre pursued elegance through delicate walls and refined visual effects. At the time, nobody could know that the structural approach perfected at Chartres would become the dominant model for many of Europe's greatest cathedrals. Not every religious community embraced lavish decoration. Orders such as the Cistercians preferred simplicity, believing modest architecture better reflected spiritual discipline. Financial realities also encouraged restraint, but simplicity itself became an artistic choice. Churches with clean lines, balanced proportions, and limited decoration demonstrated that beauty did not always require extravagance. By the middle of the 13th century, Paris had become the architectural heart of Europe. This reputation owed much to King Louis IX, whose image as the ideal Christian ruler elevated French artistic prestige. His greatest architectural achievement was the Sainte-Chapelle, designed to house the crown of thorns and other sacred relics. Massive stained glass windows dominated the interior, reducing the stone framework to a delicate skeleton of columns and arches. The chapel resembled an enormous jeweled reliquary rather than a traditional church, and its breathtaking appearance inspired rulers throughout Europe to imitate its design. At the same time, builders continued refining Gothic architecture. The rebuilding of Saint-Denis introduced increasingly complex stone tracery that divided windows into elegant geometric patterns, while giant rose windows gave rise to the Rayonnant style. Architecture became lighter, more intricate, and visually sophisticated as walls dissolved into glass, supported by remarkably delicate stone frameworks. For many years, historians believed Gothic architecture reached its peak around 1300 before entering a period of decline. Modern scholarship presents a different picture. Rather than fading, Gothic diversified. Regional styles multiplied, architects experimented more freely, and patrons commissioned an ever wider variety of buildings. The French model remained influential, but outside France it was transformed in creative ways rather than simply copied. One of the finest examples appeared in Prague under Emperor Charles IV. After Prague became an archbishopric and later the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles launched an ambitious rebuilding of St. Vitus Cathedral. His architects, Matthew of Arras and later Peter Parler, drew inspiration from French Rayonnant architecture but refused to imitate it exactly. Peter Parler introduced flowing tracery, dramatic vault patterns, and unexpected structural effects that challenged traditional ideas of symmetry and order. His vaults blurred the boundaries between individual bays, creating interiors full of movement and visual complexity. These innovations reflected the growing importance of architects themselves. Increasingly detailed drawings allowed designers greater creative freedom while their professional reputation rose throughout Europe. Buildings such as Saint-Urbain at Troyes, Strasbourg Cathedral, and St. Stephen's Chapel at Westminster introduced decorative tracery, ogee arches, and richly patterned surfaces that influenced architecture far beyond their own regions. At the same time, another trend moved in the opposite direction. Many churches deliberately reduced decoration to the absolute minimum, creating what later historians called reduction Gothic. Mendicant orders embraced simplicity to reflect humility, yet even wealthy patrons sometimes preferred restrained architecture because of its elegance and clarity. The Papal Palace at Avignon perfectly demonstrated this refined simplicity. Built during the 14th century, it combined monumental scale with remarkably plain walls. Inside, vast rib-vaulted halls created an imposing setting for elaborate papal ceremonies filled with tapestries, reliquaries, candles, and magnificent polyphonic music. The architecture itself remained restrained, allowing religious ritual to become the true spectacle. Architects also began questioning long-established conventions. In many buildings, they eliminated capitals from the tops of columns, causing arches to spring directly from slender shafts. This subtle change transformed the visual balance of medieval interiors. The Collegiate Church of Niederhaslach pushed this idea even further by combining massive piers with razor-thin shafts that appeared almost too delicate to support the soaring vaults above, creating an intentional sense of tension between strength and fragility. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, Gothic architecture offered an extraordinary range of possibilities. Some churches celebrated rich ornament, while others pursued elegant simplicity. Designs varied according to local traditions, patronage, available resources, and the imagination of master masons. One increasingly popular solution was the hall church, where the nave and side aisles rose to nearly equal heights. Without the need for a tall, clear story, these churches were structurally stable, economical to construct, and highly adaptable. Nuremberg provides an excellent example of this development. During the late Middle Ages, the prosperous imperial city rebuilt several major churches using the hall church concept in different ways. The Church of Our Lady combined the functions of parish church and royal chapel within a spacious, open interior. St. Sebald created an atmosphere of dignity and light through elegant piers and carefully balanced vaulting, while St. Lorenz adopted a more dramatic approach with intricate net vaults and richly decorated upper walls. Together, these churches demonstrate how Gothic architecture never became a fixed formula. Instead, it remained a living artistic language that continuously evolved, allowing each generation of builders to reinterpret tradition while expressing the ambitions, beliefs, and creativity of medieval Europe. By the late 14th century, one of Europe's greatest building projects became the stage for an important debate about architecture itself. Construction of Milan Cathedral began in 1386 with an ambition that matched no ordinary church. Planned almost entirely in marble, the enormous cathedral was designed with double side aisles and a scale that rivaled the greatest Gothic churches of Northern Europe. Early plans even imagined a building that would rise far higher than Chartres Cathedral. Such an ambitious vision attracted master builders from across Europe, creating an unusual meeting place where different architectural traditions collided. The surviving records of the cathedral's building committee reveal lively discussions between Italian craftsmen and famous foreign architects invited to evaluate the project. Among them were experienced northern masters such as Heinrich Paller and Jean Mignot of Paris. Their meetings were often tense. Visiting architects criticized the existing design, while the Italian builders confidently defended their own methods. Neither side possessed the mathematical tools needed to calculate structural forces accurately, so arguments relied largely on experience, geometry, and tradition. Jean Mignot became especially well known for declaring that skill without knowledge is nothing. By knowledge, however, he did not mean modern engineering. He referred to the geometric principles that northern builders used to establish harmonious proportions throughout a building. Even so, Mignot did not believe geometry should become an inflexible set of rules. Practical experience, beauty, symbolism, and established building customs all remained equally important. The Italian masters answered with their own arguments, drawing inspiration from classical philosophy and the belief that architectural proportions should reflect the balanced proportions of the human body. Eventually, both sides reached a compromise. A revised geometric system reduced the planned height of the nave to a more practical 45 meters, creating a design that blended Northern Gothic ideas with Italian traditions. The debates at Milan demonstrated that Italian architects were becoming increasingly confident in developing their own design philosophy rather than simply following Northern Gothic practice. Although some of Milan's methods still reflected older Romanesque traditions, they also pointed toward the architectural thinking that would soon define the Renaissance. This transition became even clearer with Filippo Brunelleschi. In 1417, he received the commission for the Ospedale degli Innocenti in Florence, a building often regarded as one of the first true works of Renaissance architecture. Yet the change was far from sudden. While designing this elegant classical structure, Brunelleschi was simultaneously solving one of the greatest engineering challenges of the Middle Ages by constructing the enormous dome of Florence Cathedral. Ironically, he relied on a pointed profile, a solution inherited from Gothic practice because it offered greater structural stability than the perfectly rounded domes admired by Renaissance theorists. Old and new ideas therefore continued to exist side by side rather than replacing one another overnight. Beyond Florence, Gothic architecture remained remarkably strong well into the 16th century. In Spain, the reign of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile witnessed a final flowering of Gothic design. Craftsmen from the Low Countries introduced elaborate flamboyant tracery that decorated churches with increasingly intricate stone patterns. The magnificent Lion's Gate of Toledo Cathedral became one of the finest examples of this richly ornamental style, demonstrating that Gothic architecture still possessed enormous creative energy even as Renaissance ideas spread elsewhere. Many architects of the period saw no contradiction between Gothic and Renaissance forms. Instead of choosing one style over the other, they freely combined both. Few demonstrated this flexibility more brilliantly than Benedict Reed in Bohemia. His spectacular ribbed vaults at St. Barbara's Church in Kutna Hora and the Vladislav Hall in Prague transformed traditional Gothic ribs into dramatic looping patterns that seemed to ignore conventional structural logic. Yet in the same buildings, he incorporated unmistakably Renaissance details, including classical windows and portals, often twisting familiar forms into completely original compositions. His work proved that creativity mattered more than strict loyalty to any single architectural style. Because of this gradual blending of ideas, the arrival of Renaissance architecture cannot be used as a clear dividing line between the medieval and modern worlds. Architectural change unfolded slowly, differently in every region, and often across several generations. The same uncertainty surrounds the Protestant Reformation. Religious change undoubtedly transformed Europe, yet it did not erase the medieval belief that churches were physical expressions of Christian faith. Throughout the Middle Ages, magnificent churches represented far more than technical achievement or artistic ambition. They embodied the spiritual identity of entire communities. Even as architects experimented with daring structures and increasingly complex designs, the deeper purpose of church building remained largely unchanged. Medieval thinkers continued to believe that architecture reflected divine order. Inspired by writers such as St. Augustine, they saw harmony, proportion, and beauty as earthly reflections of God's perfect creation. Of course, not everyone accepted this vision without question. Reform movements long before the Protestant Reformation challenged whether the Christian community truly required such magnificent buildings at all. Groups including the Hussites and the Lollards questioned the wealth invested in churches and asked whether faith depended upon monumental architecture. The Reformation reopened these debates on an even greater scale. Yet rather than diminishing the importance of church buildings, these religious conflicts ultimately reshaped and reinforced their significance, ensuring that architecture remained one of the most powerful expressions of belief, identity, and authority throughout early modern Europe. Between 1050 and 1500, Catholicism remained the dominant religion across Western and Central Europe, but its position was never completely secure. During the early Middle Ages, Christianity expanded into new territories through conquest, missionary work, and political alliances. Victories in Spain, the establishment of the Crusader states, and the occupation of former Byzantine lands appeared to confirm its unstoppable growth. Yet by the beginning of the 14th century, the situation had changed dramatically. While Christian rule in Spain continued to advance, eventually ending with the capture of Granada in 1492, the Eastern Mediterranean told a different story. Constantinople returned to Byzantine control in 1261, Acre fell to Muslim forces in 1291, and the Crusader kingdoms disappeared. Only a handful of islands remained under Catholic rule as the expanding Ottoman Empire steadily advanced across the Balkans and threatened southern Europe. Within Europe itself, the Church appeared strong, but beneath the surface its authority depended as much on persuasion as on power. Medieval Catholicism expected believers to accept the teachings of the Church without requiring them to understand complex theology. As a result, many ordinary Christians held beliefs that theologians might consider inaccurate without realizing they had crossed the boundaries of accepted doctrine. A person could unknowingly think ideas later judged heretical while remaining a loyal member of the Church. Rather than existing as a simple divide between orthodoxy and heresy, medieval religious life occupied a broad and uncertain middle ground filled with different interpretations, personal uncertainty, and incomplete understanding. Although theologians gradually clarified certain doctrines, many areas of belief remained open to interpretation. Church leaders could define official teaching, but enforcing those teachings in everyday life proved much more difficult. Since Christianity emphasized free will, faith could never rely solely on obedience. People had to choose salvation willingly, and the Church constantly sought to convince believers that its path offered the only secure route to eternal life, while human weakness continued to tempt them toward sin. The greatest challenges to Catholicism, therefore, often came from within rather than from outside. Islam certainly remained a military rival, especially around the Mediterranean, but relatively few people in Western Europe understood its beliefs in any meaningful way. For most Christians, it represented a distant enemy encountered mainly through stories of crusades and warfare rather than theological debate. Judaism posed a more immediate intellectual challenge. Christianity claimed to have fulfilled and replaced the Jewish faith, yet Jewish communities continued to exist throughout Europe. Their survival forced Christians to confront a living religion that refused to disappear. Relations between Christians and Jews were often marked by discrimination, violence, and persecution, but they were also more complex than simple hostility. At times, Jewish scholarship impressed Christian thinkers with its intellectual depth, encouraging discussion while also creating anxiety among those seeking certainty in their own beliefs. Within Christianity itself, thoughtful individuals sometimes reached conclusions that differed from official teaching. Scholars, preachers, and ordinary believers occasionally questioned accepted doctrine or emphasized certain ideas more strongly than church authorities considered acceptable. These disagreements did not always produce organized heretical movements, but they revealed how easily sincere attempts to understand faith could lead people beyond accepted boundaries. For a church devoted to guiding souls toward salvation, intellectual disagreement represented one of its greatest internal challenges. Even committed believers often struggled with doubt. Medieval faith required trust in realities that could not be seen or fully explained, leaving many Christians uncertain about their own salvation. Some experienced constant anxiety over whether they had confessed enough sins, shown sufficient devotion, or deserved God's mercy. This condition, later known as scrupulosity, combined deep religious commitment with an overwhelming fear of personal unworthiness, creating spiritual suffering even among the most faithful. Another growing concern involved the distinction between true religion and superstition. Medieval Christians believed divine power could be misused through magical practices, while some people sought supernatural help outside the teachings of the Church. As fears surrounding evil spirits and the devil intensified, many became convinced that Satan actively worked to deceive humanity by offering false promises and leading souls away from God. During the 15th century, these fears increasingly developed into beliefs about organized witchcraft and deliberate worship of the devil. What had once been viewed simply as improper magic gradually became understood as direct rebellion against Christianity itself, laying the foundations for the great witch persecutions that would follow in the centuries ahead. One of the most influential ideas shaping medieval Christian attitudes toward Jews came from St. Augustine. He argued that Jewish communities should continue to exist within Christian society because they served an important religious purpose. As descendants of ancient Israel, they preserved the Hebrew scriptures and confirmed the historical roots of Christianity. Without living Jews, Christians could be accused of inventing their sacred history. Augustine believed that Jews should remain dispersed throughout the world, living under Christian authority, but in a humbled condition that reflected their rejection of Christ. According to his vision, they would eventually convert before the Second Coming, making their continued existence part of God's larger plan for human salvation. During Augustine's own lifetime, this theory translated into a surprisingly practical form of coexistence. Although imperial laws placed restrictions on Jewish communities, Jews often participated in everyday civic life alongside Christians. Augustine himself defended the legal rights of a Jewish landowner whose property had been taken unfairly by a Christian bishop. He insisted that justice required the property to be returned, treating the man's religion as irrelevant to the legal question. In late antiquity, conflicts between rival Christian groups and external threats to the Roman Empire attracted far more attention than disagreements with Judaism. Modern perceptions of medieval Christianity, however, often present a much darker picture. Since the 19th century, many writers have assumed that Christianity maintained a constant and unchanging hatred toward Jews from its earliest centuries onward. According to this interpretation, medieval persecution represented only one stage in a continuous tradition that eventually culminated in the tragedies of the modern era. While violence against Jewish communities certainly occurred, This simplified narrative overlooks the complexity and changing nature of medieval Christian thought. Part of this misunderstanding comes from broader misconceptions about the Middle Ages themselves. Renaissance thinkers portrayed the medieval period as an age dominated by ignorance, superstition, and intolerance. Within that framework, hostility toward Jews appeared to fit naturally, reinforcing an image of medieval Europe as uniformly oppressive. Modern scholarship, however, has shown that religious life during these centuries was far more varied, contradictory, and dependent upon local circumstances than earlier historians believed. The widespread use of the term anti-Semitism has also shaped how medieval history is interpreted. Originally coined in 19th century Europe to describe political movements opposing Jewish civil rights, the term reflected modern racial theories rather than medieval religious thinking. As violent attacks against Jews increased during the 19th and 20th centuries, historians began applying the same label to earlier periods, creating the impression that medieval and modern hostility toward Jews belonged to one continuous phenomenon. While this approach highlights genuine episodes of persecution, it risks ignoring the very different religious, political, and cultural contexts in which medieval conflicts developed. Following the Holocaust, the concept of anti-Semitism became even more influential. For many scholars, it offered an explanation for centuries of discrimination, while also helping distinguish modern racial ideology from earlier religious disagreements. More recently, historians have increasingly preferred the term anti-Judaism when discussing the medieval period because hostility usually focused on religious belief rather than biological race. Even this newer term, however, has limitations. It can still suggest that Christian attitudes remained fixed and uniform across nearly 1,000 years, when in reality they changed significantly from one century, region, and community to another. Daily life reveals a far more complicated relationship. Jewish communities survived across much of medieval Europe because despite periodic violence and discrimination, they were generally tolerated by Christian authorities. Tolerance did not mean equality or complete acceptance. Jewish life was shaped by a mixture of legal protection, social prejudice, economic cooperation, religious disagreement, and occasional outbreaks of persecution. The balance between these forces differed greatly from place to place and from one generation to the next. Understanding medieval Christianity itself makes the picture even more complex. There was no single Christian experience shared by everyone. Official church doctrine often differed from popular belief, while clergy, scholars, nobles, merchants, and peasants all experienced religion in different ways. Christianity in the 9th century looked very different from Christianity in the 12th or 15th century, just as religious life in multicultural cities, such as those of medieval Spain, differed greatly from that of isolated villages in France or Germany. Because Christian society constantly evolved, attitudes toward Jews evolved as well. Rather than imagining one permanent Christian hostility toward Judaism, it is more accurate to see medieval Europe as a society filled with competing ideas, changing political realities, and diverse local experiences. Relations between Christians and Jews ranged from cooperation and peaceful coexistence to suspicion, discrimination, and violence. They were shaped not by a single timeless ideology, but by the shifting religious, social, and political circumstances of medieval Europe. It is easy to assume that medieval Christians constantly thought about Jews, but the reality was almost certainly very different. Most people rarely, if ever, encountered Jewish communities, especially outside the larger towns. Daily life revolved around far more immediate concerns. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, the celebration of Mass, the cycle of religious festivals, and the hope of receiving help from saints shaped ordinary Christian experience far more than questions about Judaism. At the same time, people struggled with war, disease, famine, heavy taxation, and the authority of local nobles. For most villagers and townspeople, survival itself demanded far more attention than the small Jewish communities that occasionally appeared in their lives. Those Christians who did know Jews often encountered them not as abstract religious rivals, but as neighbors, merchants, physicians, craftsmen, clients, or business partners. Because of these everyday relationships, attitudes toward Jews were far more varied than simple hostility. At the highest levels of the Church, many popes continued to follow the ideas of St. Augustine, insisting that Jews should be protected rather than destroyed. Papal decrees repeatedly defended Jewish communities from forced conversion and unnecessary violence while recognizing their right to practice their religion. One of the strongest examples came from Pope Gregory the Great in the late 6th century. Although Gregory criticized certain aspects of Jewish life, such as the ownership of Christian slaves, he also insisted that Jews living in Italy deserved legal protection. They could not be forced into Christianity, and church authorities were expected to defend their right to worship peacefully. His influence helped prevent local conflicts from turning into widespread persecution. Early medieval rulers often behaved in similar ways. In Merovingian Gaul, Jewish communities participated in trade, appeared before courts, maintained relationships with kings, and openly debated religious questions with Christian leaders. In Visigothic Spain, Jews initially enjoyed equal legal status under Arian rulers. Only after the kingdom adopted Catholicism did royal policy become increasingly restrictive, eventually calling for conversion or expulsion. Even then, the repeated need to issue anti-Jewish laws suggests that these policies were difficult to enforce and often met with resistance. Local bishops and church councils likewise displayed inconsistent attitudes. Some accepted Jewish communities within their cities, while others attempted to convert or remove them. Church legislation often discouraged close social contact between Christians and Jews, yet everyday reality proved much more flexible. In many places, Christians and Jews continued living and working alongside one another despite official efforts to separate them. Moments of violence should therefore be understood within this broader context. Sudden attacks against Jewish communities often occurred only after long periods of peaceful coexistence. When persecution broke out, many Jews fled to neighboring towns where they were accepted once again, showing that hostility was rarely universal across medieval Europe. The Carolingian Empire of the 8th and 9th centuries provides another example. Jewish communities certainly faced suspicion and occasional discrimination, but they generally escaped the violent campaigns directed against other peoples during Carolingian expansion. Most senior churchmen paid little attention to Jews, and although Archbishop Agobard of Lyon wrote bitter attacks against them during the 820s, his views seem to have reflected personal concerns rather than a widespread movement. Significantly, this period witnessed neither mass expulsions nor organized violence against Jewish communities. By the 11th century, small groups of Jews had begun settling farther north in regions that were gradually developing into the medieval kingdoms of Germany, France, and England. Their survival through centuries of Viking raids, warfare, and political instability was remarkable. Local rulers increasingly recognized the economic value of these communities. In 1084, Bishop Rudiger of Speyer invited Jews to settle in his city, granting them extensive legal privileges, freedom of trade, permission to own property, establish cemeteries, employ Christian servants, and even assist in defending the town's walls. Although he housed them in a protected district, this reflected concern for their wealth rather than hostility toward their religion. Throughout much of the 11th and early 12th centuries, Jewish communities gradually became established parts of local society. The historical record contains surprisingly little evidence of anti-Jewish violence before 1096, suggesting that coexistence was generally more common than conflict. This does not mean prejudice disappeared, but local authorities often managed to prevent tensions from becoming open violence. The situation changed dramatically during the First Crusade. In 1096, groups of crusaders attacked Jewish communities throughout the Rhineland, committing massacres that shocked both Jews and many Christians. These tragedies left a permanent mark on Jewish memory and have strongly influenced later interpretations of medieval Christian-Jewish relations. Yet even during these attacks, reality remained complex. Some bishops risked their own safety to shelter Jewish families. Many Christians hid Jewish neighbors in their homes, and numerous survivors eventually returned to rebuild their communities after the violence ended. During the following centuries, evidence of hostility became increasingly common. Jews faced growing restrictions, accusations of usury, false claims of ritual murder and desecration of the Eucharist, public disputations, the destruction of Jewish books, financial exploitation by rulers, and eventually expulsion from kingdoms such as England, France, Spain, Portugal, and parts of Germany. Nevertheless, these developments should not erase the earlier centuries of coexistence. Medieval relations between Christians and Jews were never defined by a single, unchanging pattern, but evolved continuously under the influence of political ambition, religious belief, economic interests, and local circumstances. These events cannot simply be dismissed. Episodes of violence, false accusations, forced conversions, and expulsions were real dangers that Jewish communities had to live with throughout the Middle Ages. Yet they should also be understood within a much broader historical context. Such crises did not occur everywhere at the same time, nor did they define everyday life across all of Europe. Most Christians and Jews never personally witnessed incidents like the burning of the Talmud in Paris in 1242. Although such moments deeply affected Jewish communities, they usually did not permanently destroy ordinary relationships once the immediate crisis had passed. Local politics, ambitious rulers, economic pressures, and regional tensions often played just as large a role as religious hostility itself. The policies of medieval kings perfectly illustrate these contradictions. Monarchs frequently described Jews as being under royal protection, encouraging their commercial activities and benefiting from their financial expertise. At the same time, they exploited that dependence by imposing heavy taxes, demanding extraordinary payments, or confiscating wealth whenever political circumstances required. Kings publicly condemned money lending with interest while privately borrowing large sums from Jewish financiers. Some rulers dismissed accusations such as ritual murder, while others accepted them and responded with harsh punishments. Even rulers who eventually expelled Jewish communities often arranged safe passage and attempted, at least officially, to protect their property during departure. Royal policy therefore shifted constantly according to political advantage rather than following one fixed attitude. The papacy generally remained closer to the principles first outlined by St. Augustine. Throughout the Middle Ages, successive popes reissued documents confirming that Jews should not be harmed, forced to convert, or deprived of their right to worship. Even Pope Innocent III, remembered for strengthening papal authority, insisted that Jewish communities should be protected from violence. At the same time, he also introduced measures designed to separate Jews more clearly from Christian society. He opposed Jewish money lending, discouraged close social interaction between Christians and Jews, prohibited Jews from employing Christian servants, and required distinctive clothing so Christians could recognize them more easily. Other popes approved public debates between rabbis and clergy, ordered copies of the Talmud burned, or encouraged conversion sermons. Even so, the official papal position continued to reject forced conversion and upheld the principle that Jewish communities should remain under Christian protection. Individual churchmen often behaved very differently from official church policy. Some bishops offered sanctuary to Jewish families during periods of violence, while others abandoned them or even cooperated with attackers. Monasteries regularly bought land from Jews, sold property to them, and maintained commercial relationships despite theological disagreements. Certain preachers deliberately portrayed Jews as enemies of Christianity in order to promote local saints or pilgrimage shrines. Others, including Bernard of Clairvaux, strongly condemned attacks on Jews and worked to prevent the massacres that accompanied the First Crusade. Dominican friars frequently criticized Judaism in public sermons, while other scholars actively sought Jewish teachers to improve their understanding of Hebrew and the Old Testament. Such sharply contrasting attitudes demonstrate that there was never a single Christian position shared by every member of the clergy. The same diversity appeared among secular nobles. Some welcomed Jewish communities because they strengthened local economies, while others expelled them for political or financial reasons. Noblemen condemned Jewish lending practices when convenient, yet often depended upon Jewish loans to finance wars or crusades. During military campaigns, some knights massacred Jewish communities, whereas others protected them. Crusaders who attacked Jews in Europe sometimes accepted their presence peacefully in the cities of the Holy Land once those territories came under Christian rule. Ordinary Christians were equally difficult to categorize. Historical records preserve the results of violence, but rarely explain the motivations behind individual actions. During the same centuries that witnessed blood libel accusations, mob attacks, and growing intolerance, countless Christians also sheltered Jewish neighbors during times of danger. Many Jewish families lived comfortably in small towns, where only one or two Jewish households existed among predominantly Christian populations. During the Black Death, some communities blamed and attacked Jews, while neighboring towns experienced no violence at all. Similar patterns appeared with accusations of ritual murder, which spread unevenly across Europe rather than affecting every region. Daily life often depended far more on cooperation than conflict. Christians and Jews traded together, formed long-term business partnerships, and appeared together in court, where Christian witnesses sometimes testified in defense of Jewish neighbors. In Spain, many Jews served as royal administrators, tax collectors, physicians, merchants, and craftsmen. Although these influential positions occasionally generated resentment, they also made Jewish communities an essential part of Spanish society. Even after the devastating anti-Jewish riots of 1391, many relationships between Christians and Jews continued. Business partnerships survived, friendships endured, and there were even occasional marriages and romantic relationships that sometimes led individuals to convert. Human experience rarely followed the simple divisions suggested by later historical stereotypes. Perhaps the strongest evidence used to argue for widespread medieval hostility toward Jews is the series of expulsions from England, France, Spain, Portugal, and parts of Germany near the end of the Middle Ages. Yet these expulsions were far from universal. Different rulers made different decisions for different reasons. While some kingdoms forced Jews to leave, others continued protecting them. Jewish communities remained in Italy under papal authority, and many expulsions in German-speaking lands proved temporary or highly localized. Jews often settled in nearby towns or later returned when political circumstances changed. At the same time, the rulers of Poland and Lithuania welcomed thousands of Jewish refugees, providing new opportunities for communities displaced from Western Europe. Even expulsion did not end Christian concern with Judaism. In Spain and Portugal, the mass conversions following the violence of 1391 created large populations of converts known as conversos, or new Christians. Church and royal authorities increasingly suspected that many secretly continued practicing Judaism. One justification for the expulsion of 1492 was the belief that remaining Jewish communities encouraged these converts to abandon Christianity. Whether such fears reflected reality remains debated, but the Spanish Inquisition aggressively investigated suspected cases of hidden Judaism. Over time, suspicion shifted away from religion alone and toward ancestry itself, giving rise to an obsession with purity of blood. These developments shaped not only Spanish society, but also the history of the Sephardic Jewish diaspora, whose members eventually established new communities throughout the Ottoman Empire, the Americas, the Netherlands, and later England. Long before Jews were expelled from many parts of Europe, their position within Christian society remained deeply uncertain. Their security often depended less on fixed laws than on changing political circumstances and the attitudes of local rulers or church leaders. Christianity repeatedly reinterpreted Jewish history and tradition to strengthen its own beliefs. This tendency had existed from Christianity's earliest beginnings. The first followers of Jesus claimed that the promises found in the Hebrew Scriptures reached their true fulfillment in Christ, giving those ancient texts a new meaning within Christian teaching. One of the earliest examples appears in the writings of St. Paul. Reflecting on the story of Abraham's sons, Isaac and Ishmael, Paul argued that they represented more than historical individuals. Instead, they symbolized two different spiritual paths. In Christian interpretation, Isaac came to represent the freedom offered through Christ, while Ishmael became a symbol of life bound to the Old Covenant. This approach transformed Jewish history into a series of symbols pointing toward Christianity. Early Christian scholars expanded this method by reading the Hebrew Scriptures allegorically, searching beneath the literal words for hidden meanings that they believed predicted Christ and the Church. This style of interpretation did not originate with Christianity itself. Greek philosophers had already developed allegorical reading to uncover deeper meanings within classical literature. The Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria later applied similar methods to the Hebrew Bible, seeking philosophical truths beneath its stories. Early Christian thinkers adopted these techniques, using them to connect Christianity firmly to the ancient scriptures, while also presenting it as the fulfillment rather than the continuation of Judaism. For influential theologians such as St. Augustine, the deeper spiritual meaning hidden within Scripture mattered more than the literal wording. Biblical history became a vast network of symbols revealing Christ long before his birth. As Christians increasingly interpreted the Hebrew Bible in this way, they also began interpreting Jewish history, and even Jewish people themselves, as symbolic figures serving Christian theological purposes. A revealing example appears in the Opusculum de Conversione Sua, a work supposedly written around the year 1200 by Hermann, a Jewish convert who joined the Premonstratensian order. Whether the account was truly written by a converted Jew or by a Christian author remains debated. Modern scholars increasingly view the story as a carefully constructed allegory. Rather than focusing on Jews themselves, the narrative uses Hermann's conversion to praise one religious community while criticizing another. His gradual journey from Judaism into monastic life symbolized the broader Christian ideal of spiritual transformation. The Jewish convert became less an individual than a literary figure representing every Christian's struggle toward salvation. Christians also borrowed Jewish history without always treating it symbolically. Medieval historians often place the history of their own kingdoms within the larger story of the Bible. Gregory of Tours, for example, connected the history of the Franks to the biblical narrative, presenting his people as participants in God's unfolding plan. Kings likewise compared themselves to famous rulers of ancient Israel, while Crusade writers praised Christian knights by likening them to the heroic Maccabees who had defended Judaism centuries earlier. As French royal power expanded, some writers even described France itself as a new Israel, specially chosen by God. Contemporary Jewish communities also became part of Christian religious storytelling. Medieval miracle tales frequently described Jews attacking the Eucharist, only to witness miraculous signs that convinced them to convert. Whether historically true or not, these stories primarily served Christian purposes. They reinforced belief in the real presence of Christ within the Eucharist rather than accurately portraying Jewish life. Likewise, accusations that Jews practiced usury often reflected broader Christian anxieties about money, lending, and commerce. In some cases, attacks against Jewish communities also served as indirect protests against kings or nobles who protected them. Yet the relationship between Christianity and Judaism was never one-sided. Jewish communities did not simply receive Christian influence passively. Their continued existence challenged Christians to think more carefully about central doctrines such as the Incarnation, the Trinity, and the meaning of the Old Testament. Jewish criticism sometimes provoked anger, but it also encouraged deeper theological reflection. Thinkers such as Peter Abelard even explored the possibility of treating Jews with greater fairness and understanding, revealing that medieval Christianity contained voices advocating dialogue alongside those promoting hostility. The visible presence of Jewish communities may also have influenced Christian spirituality itself. During the High Middle Ages, devotion increasingly emphasized the humanity of Jesus and encouraged believers to develop a personal emotional relationship with Christ and the Virgin Mary. Since Jesus himself had been born into the Jewish people, the continuing existence of Jewish communities may have made his earthly humanity feel more immediate and tangible to medieval Christians. Influence also flowed in the opposite direction. Living for centuries within overwhelmingly Christian societies, Jewish communities inevitably absorbed certain cultural patterns while preserving their own identity. Some historians argue that new Jewish customs developed partly in response to surrounding Christian practices. Methods of biblical interpretation and legal scholarship among medieval rabbis gradually came to resemble the highly structured intellectual style found in Christian scholasticism. Jewish religious movements in Germany also displayed forms of intense personal devotion that paralleled Christian monastic spirituality. Material culture reflected similar exchanges. The layout of many medieval Jewish manuscripts closely resembled Christian books, with the main biblical text surrounded by layers of commentary. Jewish scholars adopted effective methods of organizing knowledge without abandoning their own religious traditions. At the same time, because Christianity dominated public life, rabbis often struggled to enforce authority as completely as church leaders could. Individual Jews sometimes challenged traditional norms, producing a religious culture that was far more diverse than is often assumed. One area where Judaism retained a unique intellectual independence was the Talmud. Unlike the Hebrew Bible, which Christians interpreted as part of their own sacred history, the vast body of rabbinic teaching remained firmly within Jewish tradition. Although Christian scholars occasionally searched the Talmud for evidence supporting Christian beliefs, they never appropriated it on the same scale as the Old Testament. As a result, rabbinic literature became an increasingly central foundation of medieval Jewish identity. Despite growing scholarship, many fundamental questions remain unanswered. Historians still know surprisingly little about how ordinary Jews experienced life in a society dominated by Christianity. Church bells filled the soundscape of every town, Christian festivals shaped public life, and the possibility of discrimination or persecution remained ever present. Yet Jewish communities not only survived these conditions, but often flourished culturally, intellectually, and economically. How individuals balanced fear, faith, adaptation, and resilience is still difficult to reconstruct. These unanswered questions remind us that the relationship between Christianity and Judaism in the Middle Ages was never simple. It was a constantly evolving interaction in which both traditions shaped one another while preserving distinct religious identities. On the 18th of February, 1238, a man named Raymond John stood before the Inquisitor Ferrier in the southern French city of Albi. After swearing to tell the truth about both himself and others, living or dead, he answered questions concerning Cathar beliefs. More than a century later, another man, Hermann Gossor, found himself in a remarkably similar situation. Appearing before the Inquisitor Peter Zwicker in the Baltic city of Szczecin, Hermann also swore an oath to speak truthfully as he was questioned about the Waldensians. Although separated by time and distance, both men shared the same fate in the eyes of the medieval church. They were considered heretics, followers of religious teachings that challenged official Christian doctrine. These two stories illustrate a much broader reality. From the Mediterranean to the Baltic Sea, nearly everyone born within medieval Catholic Europe entered life as a Christian. Infants were baptized shortly after birth, worshipped in the local parish church throughout their lives, and expected to be buried in consecrated ground after death. Apart from Jewish and small Muslim communities, Christianity was not simply the dominant religion, it was the only accepted faith. Anyone who publicly taught ideas that differed from church doctrine risked being labeled a heretic, while groups sharing those beliefs became known as heretical sects. Yet not every person who questioned religion became a heretic. Medieval records occasionally reveal individuals who ignored religious obligations, doubted Christian teachings, or simply showed little interest in faith. Church courts fined some people for working on holy days or failing to attend Mass. Inquisition records preserve even more striking statements from men and women who claimed that sexual pleasure was not sinful, that nothing awaited humanity after death, or that religion simply did not matter to them. Other controversial ideas condemned by church authorities denied the existence of a first human being, questioned the afterlife, criticized theologians, or challenged traditional teachings on morality and sexuality. These isolated opinions raise an intriguing question. Was medieval Europe truly an age of faith, or did many people quietly doubt the beliefs they publicly accepted? Historians cannot answer with certainty. The limited evidence may indicate that such opinions were genuinely rare, or simply that church authorities paid little attention to them unless they developed into organized movements. Whatever the case, the church devoted far greater energy to groups that openly promoted alternative forms of Christianity. Understanding medieval heresy also requires recognizing that the church itself changed over time. Christian doctrine, worship, and religious practice were never completely fixed. During the 12th century, the number of sacraments was formally established at 7, while belief in purgatory became more clearly defined. universities transformed theology into a highly sophisticated academic discipline, using the philosophy of Aristotle to explain Christian belief. As official doctrine grew increasingly detailed, critics found more aspects of church teaching to question, particularly its elaborate rituals and devotional practices. Expectations placed upon ordinary Christians also evolved. Church leaders encouraged believers to learn basic prayers such as the Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, and the Apostles' Creed, making religious education a greater priority than before. At the same time, however, the minimum standard for salvation remained surprisingly modest. Those unable to understand complex theology were expected simply to trust the teachings of their parish priest, an approach often described as implicit faith. The Church's response to heresy changed just as dramatically. During the 11th century, some bishops believed heretics should be corrected rather than executed. Over time, however, church policy became increasingly severe. By the late 12th century, the punishment of heresy gained official approval, and during the 13th century, specialized Dominican and Franciscan inquisitors assumed much of the responsibility for investigating and suppressing religious dissent. Bishops continued to play an important role, but professional inquisitors became the most recognizable defenders of religious orthodoxy throughout continental Europe. It is also important to remember that people accused of heresy rarely saw themselves that way. They believed they were practicing authentic Christianity, not rejecting it. Occasionally, accusations of heresy even served political purposes. Pope Innocent IV, for example, declared Emperor Frederick II a heretic in 1245 largely because of political conflict rather than purely theological disagreement. More often, however, the Church targeted individuals and movements whose teachings openly challenged accepted doctrine. For many years, historians described the development of medieval heresy as a fairly straightforward story. During the late 11th century, organized heresy appeared relatively uncommon. As the 12th century progressed, however, reports increased steadily. Influential churchmen such as Peter the Venerable and Bernard of Clairvaux devoted considerable effort to confronting these new religious movements, while church councils introduced stronger legislation against them. By the middle of the 12th century, one of the most important movements was Catharism, which gained followers in Germany before becoming particularly influential in northern Italy and southern France. Around the 1170s, another movement emerged when a wealthy merchant from Lyon named Valdez embraced voluntary poverty and inspired a community that eventually became known as the Waldensians. Both groups challenged important aspects of church teaching and quickly became the principal targets of ecclesiastical authorities. The Church responded with increasing determination. In 1209, the campaign against Catharism escalated into the Albigensian Crusade, a military effort to eliminate heresy from southern France. During the following century, inquisitors gradually dismantled the Cathar movement in Italy and Languedoc, and by about 1320, it had largely disappeared. The Waldensians, however, proved far more resilient. Their communities survived across several regions of Europe and remained active in the Alpine valleys between Piedmont and Dauphiné until the 16th century, when many eventually joined the Protestant Reformation while preserving their historic identity. The final major heretical movements before the Reformation appeared during the 14th and 15th centuries. Inspired by the English theologian John Wycliffe, the Lollards criticized many teachings and practices of the medieval church. In Bohemia, the followers of Jan Hus developed similar reforms, giving rise to Hussitism. Together, these movements represented the last great wave of organized religious dissent before the Protestant Reformation transformed the religious landscape of Europe forever. For many years, the standard interpretation of medieval heresy was shaped by M.D. Lambert's influential Medieval Heresy. Across several editions, Lambert refined and expanded his work, but the overall narrative remained remarkably stable. Students learned a clear sequence of events. New heretical movements emerged after 1100, expanded across Europe, and were eventually suppressed by the Church. This framework became the accepted foundation for understanding groups such as the Cathars and the Waldensians. Today, however, historians approach that story much more cautiously. Instead of simply asking how these movements developed, many now question whether some of the religious groups described by medieval churchmen existed in the form traditionally imagined. Some scholars argue that Catharism was never a single organized religion at all, but rather a label created by inquisitors to describe a variety of local religious beliefs. Others have raised similar questions about the Waldensians. As a result, modern students must do more than memorize the traditional narrative. They must also examine how that narrative was constructed and decide for themselves how convincing both the older and newer interpretations really are. One of the most valuable sources for understanding this debate is the testimony of Raymond John, questioned by an inquisitor in 1238. Although the church accused him of both heresy and Waldensianism, Raymond spoke almost entirely about people identified simply as heretics, a term that later historians associated with the Cathars. His testimony describes a remarkably organized religious community. He recalled visiting houses where male and female religious lived together, watching followers kneel before them to receive blessings, and witnessing ceremonies that closely resembled the structured rituals of the Catholic Church. Raymond also described attending an important gathering held in 1225 at Pius. According to his account, nearly 100 members assembled to solve an administrative problem affecting the region of Razès. Because local believers lacked their own bishop, church leaders discussed the situation, selected Benedict of Termes as bishop, and formally appointed his successors. The ceremony strongly resembled the organization of Catholic dioceses, suggesting a religious movement with clearly defined leadership, hierarchy, and administrative procedures, rather than a loose collection of isolated believers. Several years later, Raymond himself underwent the movement's initiation ceremony, known as the Consolamentum. He described how sacred books were placed before him while he promised to abandon meat, sexual relations, lying, and unnecessary oaths. After repeatedly asking for a blessing, he received the laying on of hands as passages from the Gospel were read aloud. The ceremony concluded with prayers and the kiss of peace, marking his full admission into the community. His testimony provides one of the most detailed first-hand descriptions of Cathar ritual to survive. Traditional historians built their understanding of Catharism by comparing Raymond's testimony with thousands of similar depositions collected by inquisitors throughout southern France. Enormous collections of trial records survive from different decades, especially the 1240s, 1270s, and early 14th century. These documents frequently mention the same individuals, families, villages, and religious leaders. Like pieces of an enormous puzzle, they overlap and reinforce one another, allowing historians to reconstruct extensive social networks that appear to connect Cathar believers across several generations. These interconnected records also make it possible to trace the careers of prominent leaders. Individuals mentioned in one investigation reappear years later in the testimony of different witnesses, while their relatives continue to appear in later records. By following these repeated names across thousands of depositions, historians concluded that Cathar communities maintained an organized structure stretching from at least the late 12th century until the early 14th century. The evidence extends beyond witness testimony alone. Historians have also compared inquisitorial records with surviving Cathar manuscripts, including an important ritual book preserved in Lyon. Written in the Occitan language, it records the official ceremonies used within the movement and closely matches the rituals remembered by former believers during their interrogations. Anti-Cathar theological writings composed by contemporary opponents also preserve lengthy quotations from lost Cathar texts, providing additional insight into their religious beliefs. These sources suggest that Cathar theology differed fundamentally from official Christianity. Cathars believed that the material world had been created by an evil power rather than by the good God. From this belief followed the rejection of marriage, the denial that the Eucharist became Christ's body, the dismissal of water baptism, and the refusal to accept the future resurrection of the physical body. Early inquisitors often summarized these teachings in only a few short questions, but later investigations explored them in much greater detail. Another key source is a document connected with an earlier Cathar council held at Saint Félix during the 1160s or 1170s. Prepared by prominent Cathar leaders, it records the creation of several regional churches or dioceses and defines their territorial boundaries. If authentic, this document demonstrates that Catharism possessed bishops, administrative districts, and a sophisticated ecclesiastical organization decades before the Albigensian Crusade. Together with Raymond John's testimony and thousands of surviving depositions, it formed the foundation upon which the traditional picture of a highly organized Cathar church was constructed, a picture that modern historians continue to debate and reassess. As historians attempt to trace Catharism across wider regions and earlier centuries, the evidence naturally becomes less direct. The further they move from eyewitness testimonies like Raymond John's deposition, the more they must rely on scattered documents preserved by the medieval church. Most surviving Cathar writings exist only because church authorities copied them before destroying the originals. One remarkable exception is an Italian manuscript that once belonged to the Cathars themselves. Hidden within it is a coded note recording the reception of the Consolamentum in 1254. The manuscript contains theological discussions alongside liturgical texts describing ceremonies that closely resemble those found in the famous Occitan ritual book preserved at Lyon. Although one community celebrated these rites in Occitan and the other in Latin, the similarities suggest that southern French and Italian Cathars shared many of the same religious practices. Additional evidence points to regular communication between these communities. Around 1250, a former Cathar named Rainier Sacconi described numerous Cathar churches spread across France and Italy. Rather than portraying one unified organization, he described a loose federation whose regional churches sometimes cooperated closely and at other times disagreed or even refused to recognize one another. Inquisition records support this picture. During the siege of Montségur in 1243 to 1244, the Cathar leadership received a letter from the bishop of the Cathars in Cremona asking about the situation in southern France. Other testimonies from Toulouse later mention French and Italian bishops working together in northern Italy, jointly ordaining new members and maintaining contacts across the Alps. These scattered references suggest that Cathar communities, although geographically separated, remained connected through personal relationships and shared religious traditions. Historians also searched for the earliest origins of Catharism. One important source describes Bernard of Clairvaux's preaching mission to Toulouse in 1145. Its author distinguished between the followers of Henry of Lausanne and another group known locally as Weavers, whom northern writers often associated with Cathars. The account claims that many of the city's leading citizens supported these believers, implying that organized heresy had already established itself among influential families by the middle of the 12th century. Combined with later evidence from Toulouse, this passage long served as proof that Catharism was firmly rooted in southern France decades before the Albigensian Crusade. Scholars also attempted to trace connections between Western Cathars and religious movements farther east. Medieval sources frequently mention Cathar communities in places such as Constantinople and Bulgaria, while some Western heretics were even described by the nickname Bulgars. Important theological writings circulating among Western Cathars appear to have originated with the Bogomils, a dualist movement active in the Balkans. One surviving witness even remembered a condemned woman discussing heretical books connected with Bulgaria. Building upon evidence like this, historian Bernard Hamilton proposed an ambitious reconstruction. According to his theory, Western Catharism began when crusaders or travelers encountered Bogomil teachers in Constantinople around the time of the First Crusade. There, key religious texts and rituals were translated into Latin before returning with converts to Western Europe, where organized Cathar communities gradually emerged. Whether entirely correct or not, this reconstruction became one of the most influential explanations for the origins of Catharism. The traditional story of the Waldensians follows a similar pattern of reconstruction. A valuable starting point is the testimony of Hermann Gossau, questioned in the 1390s. Hermann explained that both of his parents had belonged to the Waldensian community and had raised him according to its teachings. From childhood, he had been taught never to swear oaths, lie, steal, or bear false witness. At about 15 years of age, he made his first confession to a Waldensian brother, and afterwards confessed regularly while observing periods of fasting and prayer as penance. He also attended the secret sermons preached by the brothers, where he learned to reject practices such as pilgrimages, the veneration of saints, church bells, religious images, and belief in purgatory. Many of these teachings closely resemble those later associated with the English Lollards. Unlike Catharism, however, the surviving evidence for Waldensianism is far more limited. Historians rely not only on Hermann's testimony, but also on inquisitors' manuals, letters warning about the movement, theological attacks, and official descriptions of Waldensian organization. Together, these sources portray a remarkably disciplined underground religious community. After a period of training, new members took vows resembling those of monks and became traveling brothers devoted to preaching, hearing confessions, and visiting scattered groups of followers. Secret annual meetings resembled the general chapters held by established religious orders such as the Dominicans and Franciscans. Ordinary believers continued participating publicly in parish life by attending Mass, marrying in church, and receiving the sacraments, while privately remaining loyal to Waldensian teaching. They even performed public Catholic rituals with deliberate outward conformity while inwardly rejecting their religious meaning in order to avoid suspicion. Although far fewer than the Cathar records, surviving Waldensian depositions still reveal important patterns. Nearly 200 interrogation records survive from the investigations carried out at Szczecin between 1392 and 1394. Like the Cathar evidence, these testimonies connect families, neighbors, and villages into overlapping social networks. Many witnesses explained that they had been born into the sect because both parents already belonged to the movement. Since some elderly witnesses remembered parents and grandparents who had also been Waldensians, historians concluded that these communities had existed continuously since at least the early 14th century. Together, these scattered records formed the traditional historical picture of Waldensianism as a long-lived, highly organized underground religious movement that quietly survived alongside the official church for generations. As historians tried to trace the Waldensians across medieval Europe, they discovered a remarkable web of connections stretching from Italy to Central Europe. The testimonies collected by the Inquisitor Peter Zwicker in Szczecin reveal that Waldensian brothers regularly traveled enormous distances. Hermann Gossor mentioned preachers from Poland, Hungary, Swabia, and Switzerland, demonstrating that the movement extended far beyond a single region. One of these men, Nicholas of Solothurn, later appeared in entirely separate investigations held hundreds of kilometers away in Strasbourg. Such repeated names allowed historians to connect communities that otherwise seemed isolated. Even so, reconstructing Waldensian history has always been far more difficult than reconstructing Catharism. The movement survived for over 3 centuries, from its beginnings in the late 12th century until many of its members joined the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Yet, the surviving evidence is scattered across different countries and separated by long chronological gaps. Important collections of inquisitorial records survive from southern France, Burgundy, Piedmont, Bohemia, Austria, Germany, and Switzerland, but they represent only brief snapshots of a much longer history. Historians therefore had to connect these isolated pieces into one continuous narrative. Several surviving documents appeared to support this reconstruction. Letters exchanged during the 14th century between Waldensian communities in Austria and Italy reveal that they maintained regular contact despite the great distances between them. These letters discuss an important work known as the Book of the Elect, which presented the Waldensians' understanding of both church history and their own religious mission. Although originally written in Latin, later copies also survived in the local language of the Alpine valleys, where Waldensian communities continued to flourish into the early 16th century. Together, these documents suggest that believers separated by hundreds of kilometers still regarded themselves as members of a common religious movement. Earlier sources point to the same conclusion. Around the year 1300, one description of the Waldensians explains that brothers from Italy, Germany, and southern France gathered regularly for annual meetings resembling the general chapters of established religious orders. Even more remarkable is a document preserved by an anonymous Dominican inquisitor writing around the 1260s. Among the materials he collected was a letter describing a Waldensian assembly held in Bergamo in 1218. There, representatives debated disagreements within the movement, including disputes concerning their founder, Valdez. Such evidence convinced generations of historians that the Waldensians possessed a surprisingly sophisticated organization stretching across much of Europe. The same inquisitor also preserved what appeared to be an account of the movement's origins. According to this tradition, everything began in Lyon, when a wealthy citizen witnessed the sudden death of one of his companions. Deeply shaken, he distributed his wealth among the poor and embraced a life modeled on Christ and the apostles. Because he possessed some education, he translated parts of the New Testament into the local language and began preaching voluntary poverty. Medieval historians identified this figure with Valdez, whose followers eventually became known as the Waldensians. Although recorded decades after the movement's foundation, the story long served as the accepted explanation for its beginnings. For centuries, historians treated accounts like these as reliable evidence for reconstructing the history of medieval heresy. Yet, modern scholarship has transformed the discussion. During the Protestant Reformation, historians searching for the roots of their own faith viewed medieval heretical movements as courageous witnesses who had preserved true Christianity during centuries of papal corruption. Their task was not simply historical, but theological. They sought to demonstrate an unbroken chain linking the apostles to the Protestant churches of their own day. As a result, Cathars, Waldensians, and other dissident groups often appeared less as complex historical communities than as heroic forerunners of the Reformation. 19th and 20th century historians introduced much stricter methods of source criticism. German scholars such as Herbert Grundmann and Arno Borst carefully examined not only what medieval documents said, but also why they had been written. They emphasized that chronicles, sermons, theological debates, trial records, and inquisitorial manuals all belong to different literary genres, each shaping its presentation of heresy in distinctive ways. A theological dialogue, for example, might present an imaginary debate between a Catholic and a heretic without accurately recording the beliefs of any real individual. Likewise, inquisitorial confessions could reflect the wording of an inquisitor's questions rather than the genuine opinions of the accused. Groundbreaking studies demonstrated how easily historians could mistake inquisitorial records for objective evidence. In some cases, prisoners merely repeated the accusations read aloud to them until the interrogation ended. Robert Lerner's influential work on the supposed Free Spirit movement showed that many historians had reconstructed an organized sect from confessions largely shaped by official church documents rather than by an actual religious community. This discovery encouraged scholars to reconsider many other medieval heresies as well. Although historians such as Arno Borst remained convinced that Cathars were real, they insisted that every source had to be read critically and within its literary context. Later scholars pushed these questions even further. Books with titles such as Inventing Heresy and The Imagined Heretic argued that medieval authorities may have exaggerated, simplified, or even created the appearance of coherent heretical movements in order to justify persecution. No historian influenced this debate more than R.I. Moore. In The Formation of a Persecuting Society, he argued that between roughly 950 and 1250 European institutions increasingly defined themselves by identifying and suppressing groups considered dangerous. Heretics, Jews, and lepers all became targets of expanding systems of exclusion and persecution. Moore's argument shifted the central historical question. Instead of asking only how heretical movements developed, historians began asking whether church authorities themselves played a decisive role in creating the categories they later sought to destroy. This new perspective fundamentally changed the study of medieval heresy and continues to shape scholarly debate today. The debate over medieval heresy has therefore shifted from asking who the Cathars and Waldensians were to asking whether these movements existed in the organized form traditionally described. Historians such as Ewan Cameron questioned whether the Waldensians living in the Alpine valleys during the 15th and 16th centuries could truly be connected by an unbroken line to Valdez, the merchant of Lyon, who supposedly founded the movement in the 1170s. He also suggested that church authorities may sometimes have applied the label Waldensian to a wide variety of local religious dissenters who shared little beyond the Church's suspicion of them. Grado Merlo pushed this argument even further. Rather than speaking of one Waldensian movement, he deliberately referred to multiple Waldensianisms. Instead of assuming continuity across centuries and countries, he examined each surviving collection of inquisitorial records as an independent case. Every set of trials revealed communities shaped by their own local circumstances, customs, and historical experiences. Rather than discovering one international underground organization, Merlo found a series of distinct religious groups whose similarities did not necessarily prove they belonged to the same movement. His work challenged centuries of scholarship that had sought to construct one continuous Waldensian history stretching from the 12th century to the Protestant Reformation. A similar reassessment transformed the study of Catharism. Mark Pegg based his research almost entirely on a single manuscript containing more than 5,000 inquisitorial interrogations from southern France during the years 1245 and 1246. Inspired by anthropological methods, he treated these records as a close study of one particular society rather than evidence for an international religious organization. According to Pegg, Dominican inquisitors arrived with highly developed theological ideas and interpreted ordinary local customs through that intellectual framework. Gestures of respect, greetings, and acts of courtesy performed by villagers could easily be transformed during questioning into elaborate religious rituals that may never have existed in the form imagined by the inquisitors. Because Pegg deliberately limited himself to one body of evidence, he refused to combine it with many of the sources traditionally used to reconstruct Catharism. Testimonies from other inquisitions, ritual books, descriptions of bishops and councils, and documents from Italy were left outside his analysis. As a result, the picture that emerged looked very different from the traditional one. Instead of a disciplined international church with bishops, councils, and carefully defined doctrine, Pegg described scattered groups of mildly dissident believers whose ideas were gradually reshaped into a coherent heresy by the assumptions of church investigators. R.I. Moore advanced this revisionist interpretation even more dramatically in The War on Heresy. By deliberately echoing the modern phrase, war on terror, Moore encouraged readers to consider whether medieval churchmen had, in some sense, created the enemy they believed they were fighting. He argued that during the late 12th and early 13th centuries, two separate developments merged. On one side stood theologians at the University of Paris debating the ancient dualist religion of Manichaeism. On the other stood Cistercian churchmen confronting contemporary religious dissent. According to Moore, these two strands combined to produce an elaborate theological portrait of dualist heresy, which inquisitors then projected onto local religious movements that were far less organized and far less radical than later generations imagined. Moore's arguments persuaded many historians, although they remain highly controversial. He questioned the authenticity of important documents, such as the Acts of the Council of St. Felix, and dismissed theories linking Western Cathars to the Bogomils of southeastern Europe. Specialists continue to debate these issues in great detail, and no universal agreement has emerged. Yet the broader questions raised by Moore have permanently changed the study of medieval heresy. At the heart of the debate lies an important methodological problem. Earlier, historians compared their work to archaeology. Just as an archaeologist reconstructs an ancient pot from a handful of surviving fragments, historians attempted to rebuild lost religious movements from scattered documents, interrogation records, letters, and theological writings. Since heretical groups often operated secretly, and many of their own records disappeared, gaps in the evidence seemed inevitable. Historians therefore believed it was reasonable to connect isolated pieces into one larger historical picture. Modern scholars ask whether that reconstruction sometimes went too far. References in inquisitorial records suggest that Cathars and Waldensians possessed financial accounts, wills, administrative documents, and other ordinary records that would have revealed much about their daily lives. Almost none of these documents survive. Instead, historians depend largely upon sources written by their opponents. The temptation to fill those gaps by constructing orderly historical narratives may have encouraged earlier generations to see stronger organization and greater continuity than the evidence itself can firmly demonstrate. Another concern involves the natural human tendency to impose order upon incomplete evidence. Historians often seek clear patterns, coherent structures, and master narratives that explain the past. In doing so, they may unintentionally organize scattered facts into systems that never actually existed. The debate over medieval heresy therefore reflects not only disagreements about the Middle Ages, but also different philosophies of historical interpretation itself. Modern perspectives can also shape historical conclusions. Just as Protestant and Catholic historians once interpreted medieval heresy through the lens of their own religious disputes, contemporary scholars may also be influenced by present-day concerns about power, persecution, institutions, and identity. Every generation brings new questions to medieval sources, making complete objectivity impossible. Ironically, medieval churchmen themselves also manipulated the image of heresy according to circumstance. When appealing to kings or bishops for stronger action, papal letters often exaggerated the size and danger of heretical movements. Yet theological writings frequently minimized them, portraying heretical sects as small, divided, and ultimately insignificant compared with the universal church. This reflected an ancient Christian tradition inherited from the Church Fathers. The true church was presented as united, eternal, and worldwide, while heretical groups appeared fragmented, temporary, and weak. The medieval church therefore both magnified and diminished heresy, whenever doing so best served its own purposes. A reminder that historical descriptions of these movements have always been shaped by the intentions of those who recorded them. The modern debate over medieval heresy also reminds historians that medieval sources themselves were never accepted without question, even by the people who created them. Church authorities understood that inquisitorial records could contain mistakes, exaggerations, or even false confessions. One striking example is the Dominican Inquisitor Robert Le Bougre, who became infamous for condemning innocent people alongside genuine suspects. His methods eventually alarmed the church so much that he was removed from office and imprisoned. Later, serious doubts arose about a collection of inquisitorial records produced at Carcassonne during the 1280s. These documents became known as the Suspect Books, and Pope Clement V personally ordered them to be examined. Such actions reveal that medieval church leaders themselves recognized an important distinction between what appeared in official records and what had actually happened. This awareness raises an important historical question. If some records were considered unreliable, did that also imply that many others were trusted because they had been produced more carefully? The existence of doubtful evidence does not automatically invalidate every surviving source. Instead, it reminds historians that each document must be evaluated individually rather than accepted or rejected as a whole. Another equally significant issue concerns the difference between public rumor and reality. This becomes especially clear during the interrogation of Hermann Gossor by the Inquisitor Peter Zwicker in 1392. At the time, sensational stories circulated about the Waldensians. They were accused of secretly worshipping the devil, gathering in underground meetings, and participating in shocking sexual rituals. These accusations resembled many of the fantastic rumors that medieval society often attached to groups viewed with suspicion. During his questioning, Hermann firmly rejected every one of these claims. He declared that he had never worshipped Lucifer, had never seen anyone in his religious community do so, and had never witnessed the immoral ceremonies described by popular rumor. On the contrary, he explained that the Waldensians regarded such accusations with complete disgust and believed they were nothing more than malicious lies invented by others. What makes this exchange remarkable is the response of the Inquisitor himself. Peter Zwicker was not attempting to prove these sensational accusations. His own experience had convinced him that they were false. When Hermann denied them, Zwicker accepted the answers because they matched what he already believed to be true. A few years later, while writing a theological work against the Waldensians, Zwicker again acknowledged that these lurid stories had no connection with the movement and even repeated Hermann's own description of them as disgusting. This rare moment of agreement between an accused heretic and an inquisitor offers an important lesson. Although they disagreed profoundly about religion, Both men recognized the difference between genuine religious dissent and imaginary crimes created by rumor and fear. Their conversation reminds historians that medieval inquisitors were not always willing to accept every popular accusation without question. Some clearly distinguished between authentic evidence and sensational myths, making the surviving records far more complex than simple instruments of persecution. Rather than presenting a world divided neatly between truth and falsehood, these documents reveal medieval people themselves wrestling with the difficult task of separating reality from rumor, a challenge that historians continue to face today. The activities described in these examples reveal how difficult it was for medieval people to distinguish between accepted religious practice and what educated churchmen condemned as magic or superstition. Both passages describe attempts to obtain knowledge, protection, or supernatural help, yet they belong to very different worlds. One concerns the Ars Notoria, a learned Latin text that promised extraordinary wisdom, a powerful memory, and mastery of the liberal arts through prayers, sacred names, and meditation upon mysterious diagrams. Although many theologians condemned the book as dangerous magic, more than 50 manuscripts of it still survive, showing that it remained remarkably popular among educated readers despite official criticism. The second example comes from the English friar John Bromyard, who described the kinds of magical practices ordinary people encountered in daily life. Unlike the Ars Notoria, which circulated mainly among scholars capable of reading Latin, these beliefs reflected the concerns of farmers, craftsmen, and villagers seeking protection from illness, misfortune, or everyday dangers. Bromyard's comments demonstrate that debates over magic were not limited to universities and monasteries. Ordinary Christians also developed their own opinions about which practices were acceptable and which crossed the line into superstition. By the 12th century, these discussions unfolded almost entirely within a Christian society. Earlier, church leaders had often associated magic with surviving pagan religions, but by 1100, most of Western Europe had long since become Christian. As a result, practices now labeled magical rarely invoked ancient pagan gods. Instead, they frequently relied upon Christian prayers, biblical passages, the names of saints, or other sacred formulas. The boundaries therefore became increasingly blurred. A practice might appear deeply Christian on the surface while still being condemned by theologians as magical or superstitious. Far from disappearing after the conversion of Europe, concern about magic steadily increased during the later Middle Ages. Church authorities devoted growing attention to identifying, defining, and condemning suspicious practices. The 15th century marked an especially important turning point. It witnessed the first organized witch trials, the appearance of systematic theological studies devoted entirely to superstition, and an increasing determination among educated clergy to classify forms of magical behavior more precisely than ever before. Understanding medieval magic therefore requires answering two fundamental questions. The first concerns definition. What exactly did medieval people mean by words such as magic or superstition? And how do modern historians decide which practices belong in those categories? The second concerns evidence. Most surviving descriptions were written by educated churchmen, meaning historians usually encounter magic through the eyes of its critics rather than its practitioners. Modern scholarship has therefore focused especially on areas where the boundary between legitimate religion and forbidden magic remained uncertain, including protective charms and the sophisticated traditions now known as ritual magic. Many historians also argue that attitudes hardened significantly during the 14th and 15th centuries. Earlier, theologians certainly condemned magical practices, but later writers increasingly insisted that all forms of magic depended upon cooperation with the devil. This shift produced stronger condemnations, more legal prosecutions, and eventually laid the intellectual foundations for the great witch hunts of the early modern period. Although scholars continue debating the scale of this transformation, few doubt that medieval ideas about magic became considerably more severe by the end of the Middle Ages. Medieval writers employed a wide variety of words to describe magical practices. Learned authors writing in Latin spoke of the ars magica, or magical art, alongside superstitio, meaning superstition. Other common expressions included maleficium, usually referring to harmful magic intended to injure others, and sortilegium, originally meaning divination, by drawing lots but later applied to many different forms of magical practice. As these ideas entered everyday languages, additional terms appeared, including the English word witchcraft. The most influential definitions came from Christian theologians, especially St. Augustine and Isidore of Seville. Augustine argued that magical practices attempted to produce effects that could not occur through ordinary natural causes. Unlike genuine medicine, for example, an amulet possessed no physical ability to cure illness. If such objects seemed to work, Augustine concluded that demons must be responsible. According to him, demons performed these apparent miracles in order to deceive human beings and gradually draw them away from God. Anyone practicing magic therefore entered into an invisible pact with evil spirits, even if completely unaware of doing so. Isidore of Seville expanded this understanding by compiling an extensive catalogue of magical practitioners. His great encyclopedia described sorcerers who harmed others through spells, fortune-tellers who sought knowledge of the future, and many other specialists associated with forbidden supernatural practices. Later, medieval theologians relied heavily upon this vocabulary when discussing magic, making Isidore's work one of the foundations of medieval demonology. During the 13th century, however, new scientific ideas complicated these traditional definitions. Intellectuals increasingly encountered Greek and Arabic writings describing the remarkable hidden properties of plants, stones, metals, and the stars. Rather than attributing every mysterious effect to demons, some scholars introduced the concept of natural magic. William of Auvergne, Bishop of Paris, argued that certain extraordinary phenomena resulted from hidden forces built into creation itself rather than from demonic intervention. He suggested, for example, that sapphires possessed genuine natural powers capable of healing illness or extinguishing fire because of celestial influences acting upon them. Although these invisible properties remained difficult to explain, they were understood as part of God's natural world rather than the work of evil spirits. The distinction between natural and demonic magic never became entirely clear. Whenever a phenomenon could not be fully explained, suspicion remained that demons might secretly be involved. Nevertheless, the idea of natural magic allowed medieval scholars to investigate many unusual properties of nature without automatically condemning them as sinful. Theologians also refined the meaning of superstition. While Augustine had largely treated magic and superstition as equivalent, later medieval thinkers drew a subtle distinction. Superstition increasingly referred either to worshipping God incorrectly or to directing religious devotion toward beings other than God. In practice, however, the boundaries remained uncertain. Many activities could be described as both magical and superstitious, and medieval writers frequently continued using the two terms almost interchangeably when condemning beliefs and practices they considered spiritually dangerous. In recent decades, medieval charms have become an important subject for historians because they reveal how closely religion, medicine, and what some people called magic overlapped during the Middle Ages. Although certain churchmen occasionally condemned charms as magical, they remained extremely common and were often considered perfectly acceptable by both clergy and ordinary Christians. A charm was usually a spoken or written formula intended to produce a specific result, such as healing illness, stopping bleeding, protecting against danger, or ensuring a safe childbirth. Similar practices existed in many cultures throughout history, but in medieval Europe they became an everyday part of both religious devotion and medical treatment. Charms appeared in many different forms. Some were written on small pieces of parchment that could be folded and worn around the neck or carried in a pocket as protective amulets. Most examples, however, survive because they were copied into larger manuscripts, including prayer books, collections of medical recipes, and university medical textbooks. Their widespread appearance in these respected works demonstrates that charms occupied a far more important place in medieval society than modern readers might expect. Most charms relied entirely upon Christian language and imagery. A typical remedy for toothache, for example, called upon Saint Apollonia, who according to tradition suffered the torture of having her teeth pulled out before her martyrdom. The prayer asked the saint to intercede with God so that the sufferer might be freed from pain, linking the saint's own experience to the healing of the patient. This pattern appeared repeatedly throughout medieval charms. They invoked God, Christ, the Virgin Mary, or particular saints whose lives related symbolically to the illness being treated. The desired miracle was connected to an event from sacred history, asking that, just as God had acted once before, he would now act again for the person seeking help. Not every charm, however, consisted entirely of recognizable Christian prayers. Some included mysterious words whose meanings were unclear, while others contained strange combinations of letters, Greek or Hebrew characters, or unusual symbols that appeared almost impossible to interpret. These mysterious elements fascinated many users, but also created uncertainty among theologians, who wondered whether such words concealed the names of demons or originated from dangerous magical traditions. Modern research has shown that charms were not simply the practices of uneducated villagers or wandering healers. Many were copied by highly trained physicians whose medical education had taken place at Europe's leading universities. Rather than describing these remedies as magic, doctors usually classified them as experimenta, empirical cures that could not yet be explained through accepted medical theory, but had repeatedly demonstrated their effectiveness in practice. Some physicians remained skeptical, dismissing charms as little more than superstition, but many others accepted them alongside more conventional medical treatments. Theologians approached the subject with greater caution, yet even they did not reject every form of charm. Two influential scholars, William of Rennes and Thomas Aquinas, attempted to establish clear rules separating acceptable religious practices from forbidden magic. Both argued that charms containing mysterious words or unexplained symbols should be avoided because they might unknowingly invoke demons. At the same time, they accepted that Christians could carry written passages from Scripture or the Lord's Prayer as expressions of faith, provided they did not believe these texts possessed automatic magical power or required secret rituals to become effective. These distinctions left considerable room for ordinary Christians to continue using spoken and written charms while remaining within the boundaries of accepted religion. Nevertheless, uncertainty never disappeared. During the 15th century, many theologians became increasingly concerned that unofficial healing rituals might conceal demonic influence. Scholars, such as Michael Bailey, have argued that this growing suspicion reflected broader cultural developments, including heightened fears of the devil, expanding pastoral efforts to supervise lay religious life, and a stronger desire among church authorities to distinguish approved religious practices from unauthorized rituals. Signs of this changing attitude appear in several types of evidence. A small number of healers faced prosecution in ecclesiastical courts for using charms, while later owners of medical manuscripts occasionally crossed out or deliberately erased charms copied by earlier generations. Even so, outright condemnation remained uncommon. Most theologians continued accepting at least some traditional healing prayers, and legal prosecutions for using charms remained relatively rare. For this reason, many historians no longer regard medieval charms as evidence of widespread superstition existing outside Christianity. Instead, scholars such as Eamon Duffy argue that prayers and protective formulas formed part of the normal religious life of medieval Christians. People prayed for healing, carried sacred texts for protection, and sought divine help against illness or misfortune as natural expressions of faith rather than acts of rebellion against the Church. Recent research into medieval medicine has largely supported this interpretation. Ultimately, charms occupied a fascinating position on the boundary between religion and magic. Depending upon their wording, purpose, and the beliefs of those using them, they could be praised as acts of devotion or criticized as dangerous superstition. Yet for most medieval people, these simple prayers and protective formulas belonged not to the hidden world of sorcery, but to the ordinary practice of Christian life, where faith, medicine, and hope for divine intervention naturally existed side by side. Since the 1990s, medieval ritual magic has become one of the fastest-growing areas of historical research. For many years, these texts received little scholarly attention, but historians now recognize them as valuable sources for understanding the complex relationship between religion, science, and the supernatural in medieval Europe. Researchers have identified dozens of forgotten manuscripts, edited their contents, and explored the beliefs of the educated men who copied and studied them. Rather than existing outside Christian society, these works emerged from within it, revealing how even deeply religious people could become fascinated by magical knowledge. The audience for ritual magic was usually highly educated. Most surviving texts were written in Latin and circulated among university students, physicians, monks, priests, and other members of the clergy. Reading these books required both literacy and formal education, while performing many of the rituals demanded familiarity with church ceremonies and the liturgy. Some texts even instructed the practitioner to involve a priest directly. One work, known as the Book of Consecrations, for example, ordered its owner to place the manuscript itself upon the altar during Mass for 9 consecutive days so that it would become spiritually empowered. Yet despite these obvious religious connections, church authorities generally rejected ritual magic, and many such books were condemned or deliberately destroyed. Not all ritual magic texts occupied the same position within medieval culture. Some appeared almost indistinguishable from ordinary devotional literature, while others openly instructed readers to summon demons. At the gentler end of this spectrum stood the famous Ars Notoria, by far the most widely copied ritual magic book of the Middle Ages. More manuscripts of this work survive than of any other magical text, suggesting either extraordinary popularity or remarkable success in escaping official suppression. Unlike darker magical manuals, the Ars Notoria did not require readers to command spirits. Instead, it relied upon prayers, sacred names, and meditation, promising divine assistance in acquiring wisdom, knowledge, and an exceptional memory. The experiences of the Benedictine monk John of Morigny illustrate how easily this text could be mistaken for an ordinary devotional work. Early in the 14th century, John became fascinated by ritual magic after borrowing a magical book from another cleric. On the advice of a physician named Jacob, he turned to the Ars Notoria and devoted himself to mastering its complicated practices. At first, he regarded the book as profoundly holy, admiring its beautiful colored illustrations and believing it offered a legitimate path toward divine wisdom. Only after experiencing terrifying visions did he conclude that the work concealed demonic influences beneath its pious appearance. Even so, many other readers never reached that conclusion, and the Ars Notoria continued circulating widely in universities, monasteries, and noble courts throughout the later Middle Ages. Other ritual magic texts left far less room for ambiguity because they openly instructed practitioners to summon demons. Although far fewer examples survive, manuscripts such as the 15th century Munich Handbook reveal a striking blend of Christian ritual and magical practice. Before attempting to invoke spirits, the magician was instructed to fast, remain sexually abstinent, dress in white clothing, pray, use holy water, burn incense, and invoke the Holy Trinity. Only after carefully preparing himself through these religious acts would he call upon named spirits to accomplish a particular task, such as becoming invisible or discovering hidden knowledge. To modern readers, these rituals may seem contradictory, yet medieval practitioners saw no inconsistency. They believed demons existed within a universe entirely governed by God. Through proper prayer, ritual purity, and divine authority, they hoped to compel these spirits into obedience. The language of many magical invocations even closely resembled the official formulas used by priests during Christian exorcisms, where demons were likewise commanded through the power of God rather than through independent magical force. The surviving manuscripts also suggest that medieval readers distinguished between different forms of ritual magic. Scholars have observed that the Ars Notoria frequently appears alongside devotional works and religious treatises, indicating that many owners viewed it as a spiritual exercise rather than forbidden sorcery. Texts devoted to openly demonic rituals, however, were usually copied separately or grouped only with other magical manuals. This pattern suggests that readers themselves recognized an important difference between contemplative forms of ritual magic and works centered upon direct communication with demons. Nevertheless, individuals sometimes explored both traditions, as John of Morigny himself famously did. Despite these differences, most ritual magic shared several important assumptions. Its authors believed they lived within an entirely Christian cosmos where angels, demons, saints, and God actively influenced human affairs. They also accepted the widespread medieval conviction that sacred words, prayers, and carefully performed rituals possessed genuine spiritual power. Success depended not merely upon reciting formulas, but upon personal discipline. Many texts demanded fasting, confession, regular attendance at Mass, extended prayer, and periods of celibacy before any magical operation could begin. According to historian Richard Kiekefer, these requirements demonstrate that ritual magic was deeply rooted in medieval religious culture rather than standing completely outside it. The texts themselves reinforced this religious identity by claiming an ancient and sacred origin. Many insisted that their knowledge had first been revealed by God to biblical figures such as Adam or King Solomon before being passed secretly through generations of worthy guardians. They repeatedly warned that these mysteries should never be entrusted to women, children, drunkards, fools, or morally corrupt individuals. Instead, magical wisdom belonged only to disciplined, educated, and spiritually prepared men capable of handling such dangerous knowledge responsibly. From this perspective, practitioners could easily believe they were pursuing a noble and even holy activity. Ritual magic portrayed its followers as learned scholars possessing access to hidden truths about God's creation and the unseen spiritual world. Yet most theologians remained unconvinced. Whether or not demons were explicitly summoned, church authorities argued that mysterious names, unknown symbols, and secret rituals concealed dangerous spiritual forces. Even texts that appeared entirely devotional, such as the Ars Notoria, were repeatedly condemned because theologians suspected that their hidden formulas secretly invoked demons. As historians continue discovering and studying previously unknown manuscripts, it has become increasingly clear that ritual magic occupied an extraordinarily complex position within medieval Christianity, existing not outside religion, but at one of its most disputed and fascinating frontiers. One of the most important areas of modern scholarship examines how medieval attitudes toward magic gradually changed and how these changes eventually produced the great witch trials of the early modern period. The idea of the witch represented something fundamentally new. Earlier medieval magicians were generally viewed as individuals who used forbidden supernatural techniques to achieve specific goals. By contrast, the late medieval witch was believed to have consciously rejected Christianity, entered into a pact with the devil, and exchanged his or her soul for magical powers. According to this new belief, witches did not operate alone. They belonged to secret communities that gathered at nocturnal assemblies known as Sabbaths, where they worshipped the devil, performed harmful magic, committed acts of sexual immorality, murdered children, and even practiced cannibalism. These terrifying images were brought together most famously in the Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1486 by the Dominican inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, a work that became one of the most influential texts in the history of European witchcraft. This new stereotype differed sharply from earlier medieval ideas about magic. Traditional magical practitioners were rarely imagined as members of organized conspiracies devoted to Satan. Instead, they usually appeared as isolated individuals attempting to heal, predict the future, or occasionally harm others through supernatural means. The fully developed image of the witch combined several older traditions into one terrifying figure. Some of these elements came from ancient popular beliefs that had circulated for centuries. Many cultures accepted the possibility that magic could be used to injure enemies, while stories of women flying through the night were already known in the early Middle Ages. Around the 10th century, the German abbot Regino of Prum described women who believed they rode through the night with the goddess Diana. Regino himself dismissed these claims as illusions created by demons rather than real journeys. But by the 15th century, theologians had become far more willing to believe that such supernatural flights might actually occur. Other parts of the witch stereotype emerged within learned theological culture. Medieval theologians had long argued that demons lay behind magical practices, But from the 13th century onward, they increasingly emphasized the devil's direct involvement in human affairs. This shift was encouraged partly by the discovery of ritual magic manuals that openly instructed readers how to summon and command demons. At the same time, educated writers developed another influential idea: the existence of secret religious conspiracies devoted to evil. Ironically, this accusation had ancient roots. Pagan Romans had once accused early Christians of gathering secretly to worship dark powers, commit murder, and practice cannibalism. During the 12th century, these same accusations were redirected toward Christian heretics. Gradually, the stereotype evolved once again until it became attached not to heretics, but to witches, who were increasingly portrayed as members of hidden, satanic societies. Historians can identify the period when these different ideas merged into the familiar image of the witch with surprising precision. The decisive transformation occurred during the 1430s and 1440s in Switzerland and the neighboring Alpine regions of France and Italy. It was there that the earliest surviving treatises devoted specifically to witchcraft appeared, alongside the first trials in which defendants faced accusations based upon this new understanding of magical crime. Since the 1990s, historians have examined these early documents in great detail, revealing that the emergence of witchcraft prosecutions depended not only upon changing beliefs but also upon local political circumstances. Church authorities played a major role in this development. Bishops and inquisitors who had previously concentrated on suppressing heresy increasingly interpreted witchcraft as simply another form of religious rebellion and therefore claimed the right to prosecute suspected witches. At the same time, secular rulers recognized that witch trials offered an opportunity to strengthen their own political authority by demonstrating their ability to defend society against hidden enemies. Ordinary villagers who had long suspected neighbors of causing illness, crop failure, or unexplained disasters suddenly found both religious and political authorities willing to take their accusations seriously. The result was the gradual expansion of witch trials that would later spread throughout much of Europe. The fully developed stereotype of the witch portrayed witchcraft not merely as forbidden magic, but as the complete opposite of Christian society. Devil worship, secret assemblies, child murder, cannibalism, and attacks upon neighbors represented everything that religious reformers believed threatened the moral order of Christian civilization. These fears reflected broader developments taking place during the 15th century. In the aftermath of crises such as the Great Schism, church leaders sought to strengthen religious discipline and restore unity within Christian society. As part of these reform movements, increasing attention was directed toward groups viewed as outsiders or sources of corruption, including heretics, Jews, homosexuals, and alleged practitioners of magic. Even today, historians continue debating exactly why the witch stereotype emerged when it did and why it spread so rapidly across Europe. No single explanation has won universal acceptance. Instead, modern scholarship suggests that the rise of witchcraft beliefs resulted from the interaction of many different forces: older, popular traditions, evolving theological ideas about demons, political struggles between church and state, local fears and accusations, and widespread efforts to reform Christian society. Together, these developments transformed medieval ideas about magic into something far more dangerous, laying the intellectual and legal foundations for the great witch persecutions that would dominate much of early modern Europe. Throughout the previous discussions, the social role of medieval Catholicism has often remained in the background. Yet the Church was far more than a religious institution. It shaped everyday life, influenced political authority, organized local communities, and provided the moral framework through which medieval people understood both themselves and the world around them. Religion was woven into every level of society, acting at once as a force for stability and, at times, for profound social change. The parish illustrates this influence particularly well. It was not simply the smallest administrative unit of the church, but the heart of local society itself. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, festivals, disputes, and communal celebrations all revolved around the parish church. It gave villages and towns a shared identity, while also serving as the place where rivalries, cooperation, and collective responsibilities unfolded. Likewise, the moral principles developed by theologians and canon lawyers shaped political ideas, legal systems, and everyday expectations about justice, authority, and proper behavior. Religious belief was translated into practical social action through charity, mutual obligation, and the constant concern for salvation. Because Christianity was concerned with life on earth as well as eternal life, it could never remain a purely private faith. Medieval Christians believed that salvation required more than belief alone. Faith had to be demonstrated through action. Christ's command to love God was inseparable from his command to love one's neighbor. These principles, rooted in the Ten Commandments, gradually expanded through sermons, theological commentaries, and pastoral instruction into an extensive moral system governing nearly every aspect of human existence. Brief biblical commandments evolved into detailed guides explaining how Christians should behave within families, communities, workplaces, and governments. Even the familiar 7 deadly sins became the foundation for elaborate discussions of virtually every form of selfishness, greed, dishonesty, violence, and moral failure, together with advice on repentance and moral reform. Turning these ideals into reality proved far more difficult. Human beings remained imperfect, driven by ambition, greed, fear, and personal interest. Church writers repeatedly complained that Christians ignored the moral demands of their faith until it was too late. Johannes Bromyard, writing in 14th century England, produced lengthy and passionate attacks on those who neglected charity, justice, and compassion, warning that such failures endangered their eternal salvation. His criticism was directed not only at ordinary believers, but also at the clergy themselves, whom he frequently accused of hypocrisy and excessive attachment to worldly wealth and power. This highlights one of medieval Catholicism's greatest contradictions. The Church sought to guide society towards spiritual perfection while simultaneously being deeply embedded within political and economic life. Bishops acted as landlords, monasteries accumulated wealth, priests depended upon local communities for their income, and ambitious churchmen often pursued political influence alongside spiritual authority. The Church therefore occupied 2 worlds at once. It remained a religious institution proclaiming eternal truths while functioning as one of the largest landowners and political actors in medieval Europe. Separating these 2 roles is almost impossible because they constantly overlapped. Occasionally, reformers attempted to create societies that more closely reflected Christian ideals. Girolamo Savonarola's religious republic in Florence during the 1490s sought to transform politics through strict moral discipline, while the Taborites in Hussite Bohemia experimented with a radically different vision of Christian society based upon equality and communal ideals. Neither experiment proved sustainable for long. More moderate attempts at moral reform appeared in cities such as London and Coventry, where civic leaders introduced programs encouraging honesty, charity, and public morality. Even these efforts, however, often became entangled in political rivalries and competing interests. Throughout medieval Europe, the Church's legal system also exercised enormous social influence. Ecclesiastical courts did more than punish religious offenses. They regulated marriage, inheritance, contracts, wills, and countless disputes affecting ordinary people. At the same time, individuals frequently learned to use these courts for their own benefit, appealing to church law whenever it protected their interests. This interaction created an extensive network of legal authority that both reinforced the Church's influence and allowed medieval society to shape the Church's institutions for practical purposes. Economic life presented another major challenge. The Gospel seemed to encourage poverty, generosity, and mutual support, inspiring some Christians to pursue lives of radical simplicity that resembled forms of communal living. Many of the new religious movements founded during the 12th century attempted to withdraw from worldly wealth altogether. Yet, complete separation from economic life proved almost impossible. Monasteries accumulated property, religious communities required financial support, and parish priests depended upon the contributions of their congregations. Even those determined to escape the material world eventually found themselves drawn back into it. Nevertheless, the Church never abandoned its moral ideals. Christian teaching continued to remind believers that wealth carried responsibilities, that economic relationships should serve the common good, and that greed represented a serious spiritual danger. Medieval theologians increasingly tried to balance practical commercial realities with ethical principles, seeking ways to regulate lending, trade, prices, and profit without abandoning the demands of justice and charity. Although compromise became unavoidable, the Church continued resisting the unrestricted pursuit of personal gain and insisted that economic life remained subject to moral judgment. In this way, medieval Catholicism profoundly shaped Western European society. It did not eliminate inequality, conflict, or self-interest, nor could it fully control political or economic life. Instead, it provided a powerful moral framework within which these realities were constantly debated, challenged, and reformed. Even as medieval society gradually developed commercial practices that later generations would recognize as early forms of capitalism, the Christian ideals of charity, mutual responsibility, and concern for the common good remained influential forces, continually reminding medieval Europeans that material success could never be separated from moral obligation. Medieval Catholicism also profoundly shaped ideas about sexuality, family life, and the roles of men and women. Here, religious ideals, fear of sin, and the Church's desire to regulate moral behavior came together in powerful ways. Christian teaching both reinforced traditional social expectations and challenged them. The Church accepted marriage as the normal foundation of society, yet at the same time presented celibacy and, above all, lifelong virginity as the highest spiritual ideal. This created a striking contrast between religious aspirations and the practical realities of medieval life, where marriage, inheritance, and family alliances remained essential to social stability and economic survival. This tension produced lasting effects on medieval society. Some historians have viewed the Church as deeply restrictive, particularly in its regulation of sexuality and its attitudes toward women. Others have argued that Christianity also created unexpected opportunities for female independence. Women who entered convents or embraced strict religious lives could gain education, authority, and a degree of personal freedom that was often unavailable within marriage. Over recent decades, scholars have explored these questions in increasing depth, making gender, sexuality, and family life some of the most active fields in the study of medieval Christianity. The Church's influence extended far beyond morality into every form of cultural expression. Indeed, the surviving image of the Middle Ages is still dominated by the artistic legacy of pre-Reformation Catholicism. Magnificent cathedrals, ruined monasteries, illuminated manuscripts, religious paintings, sculpture, sacred music, and devotional literature continue to shape popular ideas about medieval Europe. In this sense, religion remains one of the most visible inheritances of the medieval world. Yet this picture is only partly complete. While religious devotion inspired enormous artistic investment, medieval society also produced an equally vibrant secular culture. Castles, civic buildings, romances, songs, poetry, and luxury objects reflected different motivations and audiences. Focusing only on the grandest religious monuments can obscure the everyday material culture that surrounded ordinary people. Countless humble objects, well-used prayer books, inexpensive devotional images, simple church furnishings, household religious items, and mass-produced souvenirs formed part of daily life but rarely survive in the same spectacular condition as great cathedrals or illuminated manuscripts. Expanding the study of medieval material culture therefore reveals a much richer picture. Ordinary objects gained special significance simply because they were used in churches or associated with religious rituals. Religious festivals inspired popular drama, music, seasonal celebrations, and local customs that blended spiritual devotion with communal entertainment. In many cases, the boundary between sacred and secular became remarkably fluid. A church could host civic ceremonies, while castles contained chapels where daily worship formed part of aristocratic life. Religious influence was not confined to specifically sacred places, but extended throughout the social landscape. This influence also varied according to context. Some artistic works served purely devotional purposes, while others moved freely between religious and secular settings. Mendicant friars, for example, often adapted popular songs into preaching tools, using familiar melodies to communicate Christian teaching. Audiences who enjoyed these songs as entertainment in one setting might encounter them as vehicles for religious instruction in another. The same cultural forms could therefore acquire entirely different meanings depending upon how they were used. Attempting to summarize every aspect of Catholicism's cultural influence across nearly 5 centuries and an entire continent is impossible. Local traditions, languages, artistic styles, and available materials created enormous regional diversity. At the same time, medieval Europe remained surprisingly interconnected. Artistic styles crossed political boundaries, manuscripts were translated into new languages, and luxury goods circulated through international trade. English embroidery, known across Europe as opus Anglicanum, became highly prized for church vestments, while carved Nottingham alabaster altarpieces and devotional sculptures were exported to distant regions. Religious culture was therefore both deeply local and unmistakably international. Perhaps the clearest example of this cultural influence appears in vernacular literature. As European languages gradually developed rich literary traditions alongside Latin, they remained profoundly shaped by Christian thought. Latin continued to dominate theology, scholarship, and the international intellectual community, but every medieval person spoke a vernacular language in daily life. Consequently, religious ideas passed naturally into local literature, where biblical themes, moral teaching, saints' lives, and Christian values blended with romance, adventure, humor, and secular storytelling. Examining these vernacular works reveals that medieval Catholicism cannot be treated as a separate sphere of organized religion existing apart from ordinary society. Instead, it functioned as a pervasive cultural force that influenced language, literature, art, music, law, politics, family life, and everyday behavior. Whether directly or indirectly, the beliefs, values, and rituals of the Church shaped the experiences of virtually every individual living in Catholic Europe between the 11th and early 16th centuries. Rather than standing outside medieval society, Christianity formed one of the central foundations upon which that society was built, leaving an influence that continued to shape European culture long after the Middle Ages had come to an end. The medieval Church has often been compared to a state, and the famous English legal historian F. W. Maitland famously described it in exactly those terms. The comparison was not exaggerated. Like a state, the Church possessed an organized government, collected taxes, created laws that millions of people were expected to obey, and maintained an extensive court system whose authority stretched across Western Europe. Membership was not voluntary. Baptism admitted an individual into the Christian community from infancy, and abandoning the faith could result in severe punishment, even execution. In many respects, the Church exercised powers that modern societies normally associate with governments. Yet the medieval Church was never simply another state. Unlike secular rulers, it did not claim unlimited authority over every aspect of life within a defined territory. Christian leaders constantly reminded themselves of Christ's teaching that his kingdom was not of this world and of his rejection of earthly political power. As a result, the Church attempted to balance spiritual humility with the enormous authority it believed had been entrusted to it by God. This balance was never perfectly achieved. Although church law frequently emphasized restraint and limited jurisdiction, numerous exceptions gradually expanded ecclesiastical authority into areas that had originally belonged to secular government. The legal foundation for this authority was the Corpus Juris Canonici, the great collection of medieval canon law. Its first and most influential section was Gratian's Decretum, compiled around 1140 by the Italian monk Gratian. Seeking to reconcile centuries of conflicting church legislation, Gratian produced the first systematic legal code accepted throughout Latin Christendom. His work soon became the standard textbook of ecclesiastical law in universities and church courts across Europe. A century later, Pope Gregory IX commissioned Raymond of Peñafort to organize more recent papal legislation into the Liber Extra, a carefully arranged collection of decretals that became the second major component of canon law. Later editions, including the Liber Sextus and the Clementines, completed the legal system that governed the medieval church for centuries. Around these texts grew an enormous body of scholarly commentary through which generations of canon lawyers refined, interpreted, and expanded ecclesiastical law. Despite its sophistication, the Church's legal authority rested upon three important limitations. First, canon law formally applied only to Christians. Jews, Muslims, and pagans normally remained outside its jurisdiction. Second, the Church claimed authority primarily over spiritual and religious matters, leaving ordinary secular affairs to kings, princes, and other civil rulers. Third, although both clergy and lay people belonged to the Christian community, ecclesiastical law exercised far more direct control over members of the clergy than over ordinary believers. Most disputes involving lay people and purely worldly affairs were intended to remain in secular courts. These limitations, however, were repeatedly modified by practical exceptions. Medieval society constantly produced situations that blurred the boundaries between religious and secular authority. Rather than replacing the original principles, these exceptions gradually extended the Church's influence into many unexpected areas while still preserving the appearance of limited jurisdiction. The treatment of non-Christians illustrates this complexity. Canon law generally declared that Jews, Muslims, and pagans could not bring legal actions against Christians in ecclesiastical courts. Following earlier Roman legal traditions, disputes involving non-Christians normally belonged before secular judges. Gregory IX's decretals reinforced this separation by forbidding non-Christians from owning Christian slaves, employing Christian nurses, or holding certain public offices. Jews were allowed to maintain existing synagogues, but forbidden to construct new ones. If a Jew assaulted a priest, for example, punishment belonged not to church courts, but to secular authorities because the offender remained outside ecclesiastical jurisdiction. Yet the Church's policy was not simply one of persecution. Medieval canon law insisted that Jewish and Muslim children could not be baptized against their parents' wishes, and Jewish communities were not to be destroyed or forcibly converted. Church leaders regarded Judaism as preserving the ancient scriptures that confirmed Christian truth, making the continued existence of Jewish communities religiously significant. Similarly, military action against Muslims was justified not as unrestricted aggression, but as the recovery of territories believed to have belonged previously to Christian rulers. Officially, the Church promoted separation rather than extermination. Daily life, however, rarely respected such neat legal boundaries. Christians, Jews, and Muslims frequently lived alongside one another, traded together, and owned neighboring properties. These realities forced canon lawyers to develop practical solutions. One revealing example involved tithes, the traditional payment of 1/10 of agricultural produce owed to the Church. If farmland passed into Jewish or Muslim ownership, should the Church lose its income? Canon lawyers answered no. In such cases, non-Christian landowners could themselves be summoned before ecclesiastical courts and required to continue paying the tithe. Practical necessity therefore extended church jurisdiction beyond its original limits. Similar exceptions appeared in criminal and commercial law. Blasphemy against God, for example, was considered so serious that church authorities believed it could not go unpunished simply because the offender belonged to another religion. If secular rulers failed to prosecute blasphemers, ecclesiastical courts could intervene. Questions surrounding usury produced similar complications. Medieval Christians often accused Jewish moneylenders of charging excessive interest, which canon law condemned as sinful. Rather than prosecuting Jews directly, the Church ordered Christian rulers to force repayment of unlawful profits and threatened those rulers with ecclesiastical penalties if they refused to act. In this way, canon law indirectly influenced people who technically remained outside its formal jurisdiction. The medieval Church therefore occupied a unique position within European society. It never became a territorial state in the modern sense, yet neither was it merely a voluntary religious community. Through its legal system, courts, taxation, and moral authority, it exercised immense influence across Latin Christendom while continually negotiating the limits of its own power. The tension between spiritual ideals and practical governance shaped canon law throughout the Middle Ages, allowing the Church to extend its authority gradually without ever abandoning its claim that its true kingdom ultimately belonged not to this world, but to the next. The Church's second jurisdictional principle concerned the type of dispute being judged. Drawing on Christ's teaching to render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar and unto God what belongs to God, canon lawyers divided legal matters into two categories: temporal affairs, which belonged to secular rulers, and spiritual affairs, which fell under the authority of the Church. Marriage disputes, heresy, and other religious matters belonged before ecclesiastical courts, while questions involving feudal rights, property, or ordinary criminal offenses generally remained within secular jurisdiction. In practice, however, many disputes could not be neatly classified. Some matters possessed both spiritual and worldly dimensions and were therefore regarded as belonging to a mixed forum, allowing either church or secular courts to hear them. Adultery is a good example. It violated Christian teachings on marriage while also disrupting family stability, inheritance, and social order. To avoid endless conflicts between jurisdictions, medieval law adopted the principle of prevention. Whichever court first accepted a case retained authority to decide it. Although this division appeared balanced, canon lawyers gradually created important exceptions that expanded ecclesiastical authority. Certain disputes involving lay people, such as disagreements over the right to appoint parish priests, were considered closely connected to the Church and therefore transferred into ecclesiastical courts. Even when financial interests were involved, the Church argued that its spiritual concerns justified legal control. Such exceptions demonstrated how flexible jurisdiction could become whenever religious interests were thought to outweigh secular claims. An even broader principle emerged through the doctrine known as ratione peccati, by reason of sin. According to this idea, whenever a dispute involved sinful behavior, the Church possessed authority to intervene because Christ had entrusted his followers with the power to forgive and judge sins. Since almost every legal conflict could be interpreted as involving some moral failing, this doctrine theoretically allowed the Church to extend its jurisdiction into almost every area of human life. In reality, its expansion was restrained largely because kings and secular governments refused to accept such sweeping claims. Another important exception allowed ecclesiastical courts to act whenever secular justice failed. If temporal judges neglected their duties or delivered unjust decisions, church authorities argued that spiritual courts had both the right and the responsibility to intervene. Although the exact limits of this principle remained controversial even among canon lawyers, it enabled ecclesiastical courts to provide legal remedies in areas where secular law was weak or incomplete, further increasing the Church's practical influence. The Church's third major jurisdictional principle concerned the distinction between clergy and laity. Medieval canon law regarded these as two fundamentally different groups within Christianity. Members of the clergy were almost entirely subject to ecclesiastical courts, while ordinary lay people generally remained under secular jurisdiction except in specifically religious matters. This separation became one of the central achievements of the Gregorian reforms, whose goal was to free the Church from interference by secular rulers and establish an independent legal system for the clergy. The consequences of this privilege were especially significant in criminal cases. A priest accused of theft, assault, or even homicide could normally be tried only before a bishop's court rather than a secular judge. Church authorities defended this arrangement as essential for preserving the freedom and dignity of the clergy, although many laypeople suspected that clerics received more favorable treatment. The principle became known as the privilege of the forum. In England, it later evolved into the famous benefit of clergy, a legal privilege that originally protected ordained clergy, but gradually expanded to include many literate laymen accused of serious crimes. What began as a safeguard for ecclesiastical independence eventually became one of the most distinctive legal privileges of medieval society. Medieval canon law also placed an important territorial limit on ecclesiastical authority. The Church was organized into dioceses and provinces, each governed by its own bishop and archbishop. Every Christian, whether cleric or layperson, belonged to a specific diocese, and normally only the bishop of that territory possessed legal authority over them. A bishop in London, for example, could not lawfully judge someone who belonged to the Diocese of Paris. If action was required outside his own territory, he had to rely on the cooperation of the local bishop. This arrangement both protected the independence of individual bishops and exposed one of the practical weaknesses of the Church's judicial system. The greatest exception to this territorial rule was the authority of the Pope. As the supreme head of the Church, the Pope was regarded as the universal judge of all Christians. Instead of appealing first to their local bishop, individuals could bring their cases directly before the papal court. Although later popes limited this practice to prevent overwhelming the papal administration, the principle remained intact. In many cases, the Pope appointed local bishops or respected churchmen as papal delegates, empowering them to hear cases on his behalf while exercising papal authority in distant regions. The papacy also reserved certain matters exclusively for itself. Marriage dispensations involving close blood relationships were among the best-known examples, but many other issues, including attacks on clergy, cases of illegitimacy, incestuous marriages, and requests for special absolution, could only be resolved by papal authority unless special permission had been granted. Over time, handling these petitions became a major administrative function of the papal court, creating an extensive bureaucracy while also generating substantial revenue for the Holy See. Maintaining obedience required more than jurisdiction alone. Like every legal system, the medieval church developed methods of discipline, although many of them operated privately rather than publicly. By the early Middle Ages, public penance had largely been replaced by private confession. Early penitential books assigned fixed punishments for specific sins, ranging from fasting and prayer to lengthy pilgrimages, but by the 12th century, priests were increasingly expected to judge each case individually. After the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, annual confession became compulsory for every Christian, making private confession one of the Church's most powerful instruments for shaping everyday behavior. The Church carefully distinguished between secret sins and public offenses. Hidden sins belonged to the internal forum of confession, where only the confessor and penitent knew what had occurred. Public crimes, however, could be prosecuted before ecclesiastical courts. Although historians cannot observe what happened inside the confessional because of the absolute secrecy surrounding it, surviving manuals for confessors reveal how seriously the Church sought to guide consciences, encourage genuine repentance, and restore sinners to spiritual health. The strongest punishment available to the medieval Church was excommunication. In many ways, it resembled outlawry in secular law. Just as an outlaw lost the king's protection, an excommunicated Christian was separated from the religious community. Such a person could no longer receive the sacraments except at the point of death, and also lost several important civil rights, including the ability to pursue legal claims in court. While some family relationships and legal privileges remained intact, excommunication was intended to isolate offenders until they abandoned their disobedience. Yet excommunication was never meant to be purely vindictive. Medieval canon lawyers consistently described it as a spiritual medicine rather than simple punishment. Like a painful medical treatment, it sought to heal rather than destroy. If a bishop concluded that excommunication was making a sinner worse instead of leading him toward repentance, he could remove the sentence. The ultimate objective was always the salvation of the individual's soul, not permanent exclusion from the Christian community. As canon law developed, the Church classified excommunication into increasingly detailed categories. Minor excommunication mainly denied access to the sacraments and was imposed for less serious offenses, while major excommunication completely excluded an individual from normal Christian society. The most severe form, known as anathema, involved a dramatic public ceremony in which clergy pronounced solemn curses, extinguished candles, and symbolically consigned the unrepentant sinner to the powers of darkness. Another powerful disciplinary measure was the interdict. Instead of punishing a single individual, an interdict suspended religious services and most sacraments across an entire town, region, or even kingdom. The intention was indirect pressure. If rulers offended the Church and refused to change their behavior, their subjects would suffer the spiritual consequences, encouraging them to persuade their leaders to submit. One of the most famous examples occurred in England during the reign of King John, when Pope Innocent III placed the kingdom under a general interdict, permitting only infant baptisms and last rites for the dying, while ordinary worship ceased. Canon lawyers also distinguished between two different ways excommunication could be imposed. Some sentences were pronounced directly by church judges after legal proceedings. Others, known as latae sententiae, were automatic. Certain actions, such as violently attacking a priest or monk, immediately brought excommunication simply because canon law declared them to do so. Since these penalties were publicly announced in advance, the law itself served as sufficient warning. Through this combination of territorial organization, papal authority, judicial discipline, and spiritual sanctions, the medieval church created one of the most sophisticated legal systems in medieval Europe, governing not only religious belief, but also shaping the everyday lives of millions of Christians. Although automatic excommunication appeared straightforward in theory, its practical application required far more careful legal procedures. Canon lawyers recognized that people accused of offenses deserving automatic excommunication still deserved the opportunity to defend themselves. Someone who had struck a member of the clergy, for example, might have acted in self-defense or while preventing a crime. A woman who used force to resist a violent assault by a priest could not reasonably be punished simply because she had injured a cleric. As a result, church courts gradually established that, even when canon law prescribed automatic penalties, judges first had to determine whether the accused was genuinely guilty and whether any lawful excuse existed. Only after such an inquiry could the sentence be publicly recognized and enforced. This reflected one of the most important legal principles of medieval canon law: no one should lose legal protection without personal fault. Church jurists believed that punishment should never be imposed arbitrarily and that every accused person deserved a fair hearing. They found support for this principle in the biblical story of Adam and Eve. Although God already knew Adam's guilt, he still asked, "Where are you?" before pronouncing judgment, giving Adam the opportunity to answer. Medieval lawyers regarded this as a model of due process, proving that justice required investigation, defense, and judgment rather than immediate punishment. Excommunication alone, however, could not sustain the church's entire legal system. As ecclesiastical law developed, it adopted additional penalties and legal remedies, many borrowed from Roman law and adapted to Christian principles. One of the most important was the doctrine of restitution. Roman law had originally used restitution to restore property wrongfully taken from children who lacked the ability to defend their rights. Canon lawyers expanded this idea by treating churches and religious institutions in much the same way. If church property had been unlawfully seized, ecclesiastical courts could order its complete restoration. This was not viewed simply as protecting church wealth, but as fulfilling a fundamental principle of Christian justice. Genuine repentance required returning what had been wrongfully taken whenever possible. Another powerful legal tool centered on oaths. Medieval society regarded an oath as more than a personal promise because it called upon God as a witness. Breaking such a promise therefore became both a civil wrong and a spiritual offense. Canon law incorporated this belief into its judicial system. Oaths were required from judges, witnesses, and litigants, and in some situations they even determined the outcome of difficult cases where evidence was limited. More importantly, whenever an agreement between two people was reinforced by a sworn oath, ecclesiastical courts gained jurisdiction to enforce it. Even ordinary business contracts between laypeople could become matters for church courts if the parties invoked God while making their promises. The church also strengthened its disciplinary authority by cooperating with secular governments. Canon law described secular rulers as the church's secular arm, responsible for enforcing penalties that ecclesiastical courts themselves could not physically impose. If a person remained under excommunication for an extended period without seeking reconciliation, bishops could request assistance from royal officials. In England, for instance, anyone who ignored excommunication for more than 40 days could be imprisoned by order of the king until submission to ecclesiastical authority was achieved. Through this partnership, the the Church maintained its principle of avoiding direct physical punishment while still ensuring that its judgments carried real consequences. This cooperation reached its most dramatic form in the prosecution of heresy. Church courts investigated suspected heretics, determined guilt, and pronounced spiritual judgment, but they did not carry out executions themselves. Instead, convicted heretics were formally handed over to secular authorities who imposed corporal punishment according to secular law. In this way, the Church preserved its image as a spiritual institution while relying on kings and princes to enforce the harshest penalties. The result was a legal partnership that blended religious authority with secular power, making medieval canon law one of the most influential systems of justice in Europe.